Welcome back, hey, my dear friends. Yes, you. The one somehow still awake right now.
Blanket pulled up, the world finally quiet. Welcome. I'm honestly glad you landed here tonight. Pull in a little closer, because what I'm about to share with you is the kind of thing they left out of every history class you ever sat through. Let me ask you something before we begin. Have you ever looked at a painting of a Victorian woman and felt, even for just a second, a little envious? The impossibly graceful posture, the silk gown cascading to the floor like liquid, the tiny waist, the luminous skin, the hair swept up in this perfectly architectural arrangement, every curl in its rightful place, the whole image radiating something that feels less like a human being and more like an idea, an ideal. Hollywood built empires on that image. Period dramas, romance novels, museum portraits, all of them quietly agreeing on one thing.
Victorian women were the picture of refinement. But here is what they never show you.
Beneath all that silk, beneath those gloves, and that lace, and that composure, was a daily reality so far removed from the portrait that it would genuinely make your jaw drop. Tonight, we're going to step behind that canvas, and I promise you, by the time we are done, you will never look at a bottle of perfume or a corset or even a bar of soap the same way again. Before we go any further, though, a small request. If stories like this, quiet, strange, human ones, told just for the end of the day, if they are the kind of thing that makes your evenings feel a little richer, I would love it if you hit subscribe and left a like. Not because numbers matter more than stories, but because it genuinely helps these tales reach the people who need them. And if you want to absolutely make my night, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are right now or what time it is. There is something I love about knowing someone out there is tuned in. All right, fan on if you want it. Lights low. Here we go.
Picture the year 1850. Not the 1850s of the movies, the real one. London is growing faster than anyone knows how to manage. Coal fires burn from morning to midnight, coating every surface in a fine layer of black soot.
And the Thames, flowing right through the heart of the city, is not the scenic tourist waterway you might imagine. It is, by most historical accounts, an open sewer. The smell rising from it in summer was so severe that in 1858, members of Parliament had to hang lime-soaked sheets over the windows of the Houses of Parliament just to keep working. They called it, with a remarkable British understatement, the Great Stink. Hold that image in your mind, because it is the backdrop for everything we're about to explore. In this world, the women of those portraits are getting dressed every single morning, layers upon layers. It could take the better part of an hour just to be fully clothed, and all of that extraordinary effort to look immaculate was happening without a shower, without running hot water in most homes, without the hygiene infrastructure that you and I do not even think about anymore. Here is the thing that surprises most people. Victorian society was not ignorant about cleanliness, not even slightly. There were entire books written on the subject, ladies' manuals, household guides, health encyclopedias, with titles like The Management of the Person and The Female's Friend in Health and Disease. These were bestsellers. Women read them the way we scroll through wellness content today. The difference was not awareness. The difference was access. Because those same books quietly admitted, right there in the opening chapters, that water was difficult to obtain, expensive to heat, and required enormous labor to transport. For most households, filling a bathtub meant carrying bucket after bucket from a pump, sometimes outside the house, heating each pot over an open fire, which could take the better part of a morning. And then, after all of that work, the tub of lukewarm water was shared by the entire family. Father went first, then mother, then the children in descending order of age. By the time the youngest climbed in, the water was, let us say, considerably less fresh than when it started. This is the documented origin of the phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water." That expression exists because by the time you reached the infant, the water had gone dark enough that you might genuinely miss the child inside it. Let that sit for a moment. For women of the wealthier classes, things were marginally better. If your household employed servants, someone heated the water, carried it upstairs, and poured it into the copper tub in your dressing room. You might have this luxury once a week, perhaps twice in the summer. If you felt particularly indulgent, but even then, once a week was considered quite rigorous. Some Victorian doctors actively discouraged more frequent bathing, believing that repeated exposure to water stripped the skin's natural defenses and invited illness. So even women who could afford daily baths often chose not to take them, not from laziness, but from genuine medical conviction. What most women practiced instead was something called the strip wash. Each morning, a basin of water, a cloth, and a careful, methodical approach to the parts of the body, most visible to the world: the face, the neck, the hands, perhaps the underarms on a particularly energetic day. Everything else waited. Now picture what this looks like in practice. A Victorian woman of the middle class might spend 40 minutes on her hair alone, another 20 lacing herself into her corset and arranging her petticoats. She would powder her face, add a touch of lavender water at the wrists, and walk into a drawing room looking, by every account, fragrant and impeccably turned out. And she had not fully bathed since the previous week. I'm not saying this to mock her, not at all, because she was doing exactly what her world expected with exactly the resources she had. The same way that 200 years from now, someone might look back at something we all do today and shudder quietly. That thought, if I am honest, genuinely keeps me up at night. Here is what fascinates me most, though. Victorian cleanliness was fundamentally a performance, not in a cynical way, but in a genuinely fascinating sociological way. What you showed on the outside was the measure of your moral character, your class, your virtue. A clean collar, polished shoes, tidy hair. These visible things communicated everything about who you were. What was happening beneath the dress, beneath the gloves that was private, managed quietly, never discussed. There is a particular kind of dignity in that, actually. An old belief that some things are simply your own business. But there is also something quietly heartbreaking about it, because it meant that for generations of women, an enormous amount of daily life was spent maintaining a surface while enduring realities underneath it that no one ever spoke about openly. Take the hair, for instance. Victorian hairstyles were architectural, elaborate, meticulously pinned. And yes, partly that was fashion. But it was also, in a very practical way, a solution, because Victorian women, even fashionable ones, wash their hair at most once a month. The beauty guides confirm this. One widely read manual from the 1880s states plainly that women with oily hair constitutions should wash every 2 weeks, while those with normal hair need only do so monthly. This was presented as the medically sound approach. The concern was not laziness. Repeated washing, it was believed, would strip the scalp's natural oils and permanently damage the hair, which Victorians considered a woman's single greatest physical asset. So instead, women developed alternatives. Dry powders of ground rice starch or orris root combed through to absorb oil. Raw egg yolk beaten with water and worked into the scalp. Diluted vinegar as a rinse. And the elaborate up-to-the pinned and netted architecture of Victorian hair. It was both beautiful and brilliantly practical. The actual condition of the hair beneath all those pins was invisible to anyone outside the bedroom, and a woman's loose hair, remember, was considered so intimate that Victorian social rules held it should only be seen be, why her husband. Convenient, as I said, for everyone involved. What strikes me most looking at all of this is not the habits themselves, it is the ingenuity behind them. These were not women who gave up. They were not women who resigned themselves to disorder. They were women operating within remarkable constraints, and they built entire systems to manage those constraints. Daily rituals, weekly routines, products mixed at home from whatever was available. A whole culture of practical, quietly passed down knowledge, exchanged in parlors and bedrooms and the margins of housekeeping manuals. All of it invisible. All of it hidden beneath the surface that history chose to remember. And that surface was maintained with extraordinary effort, extraordinary creativity, and a kind of dignified, private resilience that I find genuinely moving. But we are only beginning to lift the curtain, because beneath the hair powder and the sponge baths lies a world of habits that are, as we go deeper, sometimes shocking, sometimes darkly funny, and always more human than the portraits ever let on. In just a moment, we're going to talk about something far more intimate, a daily reality that Victorian women managed in near total silence, one that the medical establishment of the era had extraordinary opinions about, to put it mildly. Stay with me. We are just getting started. So, we've already established something rather unsettling, that the women in those breathtaking Victorian portraits were, beneath their silk and composure, managing a daily reality that looked nothing like the image they projected. But now, I want to dig into the thing that sits at the very center of that contradiction. Because the strange truth about Victorian bathing is not simply that people bathed less than we do. That would be too clean a story. The stranger truth is this. Victorian society believed with genuine conviction that cleanliness was one of the most important virtues a person could possess. They just disagreed rather dramatically on what cleanliness actually meant. And for women caught in the middle of that disagreement, the consequences ranged from mildly inconvenient to quietly devastating. Let me take you back to a very specific moment. It is 1865, London. A soap company called Pears, which had been quietly making transparent amber-colored soap in a small Soho workshop since the late 1700s, is about to do something remarkable. They hire a marketing man named Thomas Barrett, and Thomas Barrett, it turns out, is a genius. Not in the scientific sense, but in the human sense. He understands something about people that most of his contemporaries do not. That you do not sell soap by telling people it cleans their skin. You sell soap by telling them it cleans their soul. So the Pears campaign begins, and within 20 years it becomes one of the most influential advertising movements in history. By the 1880s and 90s, Pears advertisements are plastered across London, across American magazines, across the colonial world. One of their most memorable endorsements comes from a Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, who writes in 1885, and I want you to hear this slowly, because it's one of the more extraordinary sentences ever written about a bar of soap. If cleanliness is next to godliness, then soap must be considered a means of grace. A means of grace, soap as salvation. This was not a fringe opinion. This was the mainstream Victorian worldview, at least among the middle and upper classes. By the latter half of the 19th century, being clean had become a moral statement. It signaled yesterday. Our respectability, your virtue, your standing in the social order. The phrase, the great unwashed, used to describe the poor, was not just colorful language. It was a judgment, a verdict. It said, these people are not like us. Now, here is where it becomes genuinely complicated for women. If cleanliness was virtue, and virtue was femininity, and femininity was the cornerstone of the entire Victorian social order, then the pressure on women to appear clean was extraordinary, relentless, and deeply, sometimes cruelly unequal. Because the tools to actually achieve cleanliness, to move beyond appearance and into genuine hygiene were largely unavailable to the very women being judged most harshly for lacking it. Think about what a full bath actually required in this era. For a working-class woman in Manchester or Birmingham or the East End of London, getting clean was a logistical problem of considerable magnitude. There was no bathroom. There was often no dedicated water source inside the home. Water came from a shared courtyard pump, a street tap, or, in some cases, a river. You boiled it over a fire. You carried it inside in whatever vessel you owned. You washed yourself or your kai. Dren in a basin or a portable tin tub, and then you emptied the whole thing manually and started over for whatever came next. And this was not a quick operation. In households where 6 or 8 people lived in 2 rooms, privacy was essentially a theoretical concept. Finding both the time and the physical space to fully undress and wash your body was a luxury that simply did not exist for enormous portions of the female population. So what did women actually do? They managed. They developed practical, often inventive routines. A quick wash of the hands and face each morning with a shared basin and a cloth. A periodic, more thorough wash of the upper body, when privacy allowed. And for the rest, an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of how to project cleanliness without necessarily achieving it through clean aprons, fresh collars, the strategic placement of a little lavender water. I want to ask you something here, if you are still with me. Does any of this sound familiar? Not in the specifics, obviously. You're not hauling buckets from a courtyard pump. But the idea of managing an appearance of something while the reality underneath is a little more complicated. The performance, romance of wellness or productivity or put-togetherness while internally improvising with whatever you've got. That is not a Victorian problem. That is a human problem. And Victorian women navigated it with a kind of quiet, relentless competence that I think we do not give nearly enough credit. Now, for the wealthier women, and this is where the story takes an unexpected turn, you might assume that women who had access to servants, to copper bathtubs, to hot water carried upstairs on demand, would have been bathing regularly, frequently, gratefully, and some were, but many were not. Because by the early decades of Victoria's reign, she took the throne in 1837, a peculiar medical theory had taken hold. The idea that the skin, when exposed to excessive water, lost its protective integrity. That frequent bathing opened the pores dangerously, allowing cold air, disease, and atmospheric miasma to penetrate the body. This was not a fringe idea. This was the professional opinion of respected physicians. One widely read health manual of the period warned that women, being constitutionally more delicate than men, were especially vulnerable to the dangers of overbathing. The solution recommended was exactly 1 full bath per week, supplemented by daily strip washing of the face, hands, and wherever else the exertions of the day had made themselves felt. So here you have a society telling women simultaneously that cleanliness is next to godliness, that their moral worth is visible on their skin, and also that bathing too frequently could kill them. The only reasonable response, I think, is a very slow blink. What changed this? What finally began to shift the reality of women's access to clean water, to proper sanitation, to something approaching modern hygiene? The answer is not a product. It is not even a social movement, exactly. The answer is a map. In 1854, in the tightly packed streets of Soho in London, a cholera outbreak began. Cholera was not unfamiliar to Victorian England. It had swept through in 1831 and again in 1848. But this outbreak was different, because this time a physician named John Snow was paying very careful attention. Snow did something that seems obvious to us now, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. He went door to door through the affected streets. He spoke to residents. He recorded every death on a map of the neighborhood. And when he lay, I did that map out and looked at it. The pattern was unmistakable. Almost every death was clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. The neighborhood's drinking water, drawn from that pump, was being contaminated by a leaking sewer running just beneath it. And 616 people died because of it. Snow convinced local officials to remove the handle from the pump. The deaths slowed. And while the scientific establishment resisted his conclusions for years afterward, the idea that disease traveled through contaminated water rather than through bad air was, as they put it, too unpleasant to contemplate. The evidence was sitting right there on his map. This is one of my favorite moments in all of medical history. Actually not because it is triumphant. 600 people died, but because of what it represents. It is the moment the Victorian world began to understand that hygiene was not a moral question. It was an engineering question, a public infrastructure question, a matter of pipes and sewers and clean water supplies, not of personal virtue or social class. And, once that understanding took hold, the world began to change. Slowly, inadequately, unevenly. But it changed. By the 1880s, wealth. Ear homes in London and the major American cities were beginning to have something extraordinary. A dedicated bathroom. An actual room with a cast-iron tub, and in some cases, hot water delivered directly from a gas-heated tank rather than carried in buckets from the kitchen. The first purpose-built bathrooms in American homes appeared in cities like New York and Boston in the 1850s, but they were exclusive to the very wealthy. Objects of genuine wonder, displayed to guests almost like art. By the 1890s, middle-class homes were starting to include them as a standard feature. Working-class homes would not see bathrooms as standard until well into the 20th century. For Victorian women watching this transformation unfold, and it was gradual enough that most women lived through multiple stages of it, the bathroom represented something almost philosophical. It was proof that clean water was not a reward for moral righteousness. It was a right, a structural fact, something delivered by pipes, not by prayer. There is a woman I keep thinking about when I consider this history. Her name was Kitty Wilkinson, and she lived in Liverpool in the 1830s during the first great cholera outbreak.
She was not wealthy.
She was an Irish immigrant who had spent most of her life in poverty, but she had something that most of her neighbors did not: a boiler. When cholera began moving through her neighborhood, Kitty opened her home. She let her neighbors bring their contaminated clothing to be boiled in her laundry boiler with chloride of lime, which was believed at the time to help prevent the spread of disease. She charged nothing. She did this every day, sometimes for dozens of families, while the epidemic raged around her. And then, when the worst of it had passed, she began campaigning, lobbying, pushing against every wall of officialdom she could find, arguing that the poor deserved access to public baths and washhouses. That cleanliness should not require either wealth or a miracle. That it should simply be available. In 1842, Liverpool opened its first combined public baths and washhouse. Kitty Wilkinson became its superintendent. She is not famous. She does not appear in the portraits we associate with the Victorian era, but she is, in my mind, one of the most important women in the history of public health, precisely because she understood something that took the rest of the world another generation to fully accept, that the difference between a clean person and a dirty one was not character, it was access. And that understanding quietly changes everything about how we read Victorian hygiene history. When we look at the bathing habits of Victorian women, the once-a-week tub, the daily strip wash, the elaborate systems of management and presentation, and feel the urge to judge them, to find them strange or lacking, we're doing exactly what Victorian society did to its own poor. We are mistaking circumstances for character. These women were not bathing less because they cared less. They were bathing in the reality available to them. And within that reality, many of them were doing extraordinary, inventive, sometimes quietly heroic things to keep themselves and their families as clean as the world allowed. That, to me, is the real story underneath the bathing paradox. Not the gap between Victorian standards and ours, but the gap between what Victorian women were expected to be and what they were actually given to work with. And the further you go into this story, the wider that gap becomes, because we have not yet talked about what happened when those same women put something far more dangerous than bath water on their bodies. Something sold to them in elegant little bottles and tins, advertised in the finest magazines of the age, recommended by doctors and endorsed by celebrities. Products designed to make them beautiful. Products that were, in some cases, slowly killing them. That is exactly where we are headed next, and I promise it is stranger than anything you might be imagining right now. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a Victorian dressing room in the early morning hours, before the household is fully awake, before the day presses in with its demands and obligations and carefully arranged social calls. It is in this hour that a woman sits sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 3, before a mirror, while someone else works through her hair. This is not a scene from a novel. This is documented daily life for women of any means during the Victorian era. And the more you learn about what actually happened in that dressing room, the more it starts to feel less like a beauty routine and more like a relationship, a complicated one, with high stakes and genuine consequences. Hair, in the Victorian imagination, was not simply hair. It was biography, character, the most intimate and public thing a woman owned simultaneously, and the lengths, quite literally, to which Victorian women went to manage it reveal something extraordinary about the era that portrait paintings consistently leave out. Let me tell you about a woman named Elizabeth. Most people know her as Sissy, the nickname her family used, though the history books record her formally as Empress Elizabeth of Austria. She married Emperor Franz Joseph I in 1854 when she was just 16 years old, and she spent the next several decades being regarded as one of the most beautiful women in Europe. Paintings of her circulated widely. Women copied her style. Her image appeared in newspapers from Vienna to London to New York, and at the center of her famous beauty, the thing everyone agreed upon as the defining symbol of her appeal, was her hair. Elizabeth's hair, when loosened, touched the floor. It was thick, dark chestnut in color, and she regarded it with a combination of deep pride and, as she once admitted, genuine exhaustion. She reportedly said at one point, quite plainly, "I am a slave to my hair." Coming from an empress, that is a sentence worth sitting with every single morning, after a cold bath and a rigorous exercise routine that most modern gym-goers would find impressive. Elizabeth sat in the center of her dressing room while her personal hairdresser, Fanny Angera, worked through her hair. This ritual lasted, without exaggeration and by multiple documented accounts, between 2 and 3 hours every day. Her Greek tutor, who spent those hours teaching her languages while the hairdressing proceeded, left behind diary descriptions of the scene that read almost like poetry. He wrote of Fanny working through the waves of hair with white-gloved hands, raising and twisting and pinning, while the Empress sat perfectly still at the center of this human and aesthetic labor. And when the ritual was finished, Fanny was required to present a silver bowl. The silver bowl contained every hair that had come loose during the session. It was brought forward for inspection. If the Empress judged the amount of hair loss too high, she would become distressed. She would question Fanny's technique. She would question her diet. She would question everything, because these were not just stray hairs to her. They were evident. Sea of decline, of deterioration, of her beauty slipping away that she could not afford to lose. Fanny, being shrewd and experienced, eventually discovered a solution. She began attaching strips of adhesive tape to the inside hem of her apron, discreetly collecting the most concerning quantities of shed hair before they reached the silver bowl. She hid the evidence every morning for years. There is something about that detail that I find almost unbearably human. The hairdresser secretly managing not just the hair, but the feelings. The Empress presiding over this elaborate ritual, genuinely believing that her own crowning glory was under her control, when in fact it was being quietly managed for her. Elizabeth's hair was washed approximately every 3 weeks, using a preparation of beaten egg yolks combined with, in her particular case, fine cognac. She would not appear in public on hair-washing days. If Fanny fell ill and could not attend, the Empress refused to be seen by anyone. Her hair was that central to her identity, that completely managed. Now, I am telling you about Elizabeth not because she was typical. She was obviously not. Sissy had the resources of an empire at her discretion. So, which most Victorian women did not. But she illustrates something important. The relationship between Victorian women and their hair was not casual. It was not incidental. It was one of the most time-consuming, emotionally loaded, and socially consequential aspects of their daily existence. And for ordinary women managing this in more ordinary circumstances, with a basin of water instead of a silver bowl, with coarse soap instead of fine cognac, the challenge was in many ways even more demanding. Because here is what nobody quite tells you about Victorian hair care. Washing hair was genuinely difficult and even somewhat risky. Before modern shampoo, which did not exist as a commercial product until the early 20th century, women washed their hair with whatever soap was available. And household soap of the 1850s and 60s, even good quality soap, could strip the natural oils from the scalp quite aggressively, leaving hair brittle, dry, and prone to breakage. The manuals recognized this. They cautioned against it. One guide from 1852 states quite directly that hair should be washed once a week at most, and that even this frequency required careful management afterward to restore the natural luster that washing had removed. Other manuals disagreed. Some recommended every 2 to 3 weeks. Some stretched it to monthly. What they all agreed on was that you could not simply apply soap and water and call it done. The hair required reconditioning afterward, which meant applying some form of oil or pomade to restore what had been stripped away. The most common reconditioning agents of the era included olive oil, castor oil, and a product called bear grease, which was exactly what it sounds like, and which was sold quite openly in chemist shops and general stores throughout Britain and America. Bear grease in your hair for shine and moisture. I am genuinely not judging this. Necessity produces solutions that look eccentric in retrospect, but it is worth noting that a freshly conditioned head of Victorian hair was, by the end of that process, somewhat fragrant in ways that our modern sensibilities might find unexpected. So, what did Victorian women actually do between wash days? This is where things become genuinely ingenious. The dry shampoo, the spray can version from the pharmacy shelf, which was invented much later. The Victorian dry shampoo was a hands-on process. You took a bowl of finely ground powder cornmeal mixed with orris root, being particularly popular, and you worked it through the hair section by section, tossing and distributing until every lock was coated. Then you waited. The powder absorbed the oils on the scalp, and then you brushed it out, stroke by stroke, sometimes over a basin to catch the powder, until the hair looked fresh, and if the orris root had done its job, smelled faintly of violet. The brushing itself was not casual. Victorian manuals were nearly unanimous on this point. The daily brush was more important, more beneficial, and more hygienic than the occasional wash. One guide from 1879 recommends brushing for at least 20 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at midday, and 10 minutes again in the evening. That is 40 minutes a day of brushing minimum. Modern hair scientists, interestingly, would not entirely disagree. Daily brushing does distribute natural oils along the hair shaft, preventing the scalp from overproducing the sebum that leads to greasiness. Which is to say that the Victorian obsession with the brush was not unfounded. It was, in its way, scientifically sound. There is something Lee's in those brushed-out locks that the manuals discuss carefully, and the paintings never show. Something that was, for all their careful hygiene routines, a persistent and uncomfortable reality for Victorian women across all social classes. Head lice. Not a pleasant topic for a quiet evening, I know. But it is a genuine part of this story, and leaving it out would be like describing a kitchen without mentioning what they actually cooked. Head lice in the Victorian era affected everyone. The middle classes, the upper classes, royalty. The sheer elaborateness of Victorian hairstyles, combined with the relatively infrequent washings and the difficulty of thorough scalp treatment, created conditions that were, from a louse's perspective, practically ideal. The pomades and heavy oils used to condition and style hair gave these insects something to grip. The layers of pinning and netting made thorough combing difficult, and the social taboo around discussing the problem meant that infestations often went unaddressed until they were considerable. The remedies of the era were creative, if not always pleasant. Kerosene was commonly applied to the scalp as a treatment, which was effective, killing lice, but also somewhat alarming for anyone in the vicinity of an open flame. Vinegar washes were used to loosen the eggs. Fine-toothed bone combs were drawn painstakingly through wet hair, section by section. And for women whose elaborate updo could not easily be dismantled and reassembled, there existed an elegant little tool called a head-scratcher, a long, slender implement, often beautifully made in silver or ivory, that could be inserted discreetly into a hairstyle to reach the scalp without disturbing the arrangement above. It was, in a sense, the Victorian equivalent of the itching stick. In polite society, you would never acknowledge using it, but you owned one. Most women did. Here is what strikes me most about all of this. When I pull back from the individual details and look at the whole picture, Victorian hair culture was an enormous investment of time, labor, skill, and material resources. For wealthy women, it required a professional. For everyone else, it required either a patient friend, a cooperative sister, or a considerable amount of personal flexibility. The elaborate styles that defined Victorian femininity were not achieved casually. They were worked for, maintained carefully, defended against time and humidity and neglect, and the occasional unwanted visitor on the scalp. And through all of it, a woman's hair was expected to look as though it had simply grown that way, effortlessly. That particular expectation, I would argue, has not changed even slightly in the century and a half since. But here is a question I want to leave you with before we move on. If Victorian women were putting this much effort, this much time, this much ingenious energy into managing their hair, what about everything else? The face they presented, the skin, the teeth, the body beneath the gown. What was happening chemically and cosmetically to the most visible parts of a Victorian woman's appearance? The answer to that question is not comfortable. In fact, it is one of the genuinely shocking chapters of this entire story. Because what Victorian women were applying to their faces and skin in pursuit of the era's beauty ideal was not just ineffective. Some of it was lethal. That is where we're going next, and I promise you it is worth staying awake for.
Right.
So we need to talk about poison, not the dramatic mystery novel kind, not the kind slipped into. Oh, a glass of wine at a dinner party, though Victorian women were certainly familiar with that variety too. The poison I mean here was something far more insidious, because it was chosen deliberately, purchased willingly, applied to the face and body every single morning, often with great care, sometimes with the endorsement of a doctor, and almost always with the firm belief that it was not only harmless, but genuinely good for you. Victorian beauty culture, when you look at it clearly and without the soft focus lens of period romanticism, was a sustained experiment in self-administered harm. And the women who participated in it were not fools. They were not gullible or uninformed in any simple sense. They were people operating inside a system that told them repeatedly and authoritatively that the substances they were using were safe, while simultaneously profiting enormously from selling those substances to them. Sound familiar at all? I'm not going to answer that question, but I am going to hold it in the air for a moment, because it feels important. Let us begin with a color, pale, translucent, the white of fresh cream or new candle wax. This was the beauty ideal of the Victorian era, and not merely as a fashion preference, though it was certainly that. The desire for pale skin was bound up with class, with morality, with the entire architecture of Victorian femininity. Dark skin meant outdoor labor. It meant you worked in the fields, in the streets, in the factories. Pale skin meant you stayed indoors, sheltered, protected. It was a physical advertisement of your social position, and it was so central to the era's understanding of what a respectable woman looked like that the pursuit of it became, for many women, essentially compulsory. Here is what makes this particular history so genuinely strange. Though, the beauty ideal of pale, near-translucent skin was not purely a construct of vanity or class anxiety. It was modeled, at least in part, on a disease. Tuberculosis. By the middle decades of the 19th century, tuberculosis, then commonly called consumption, had been killing people across Europe and America for generations. Its symptoms were, to our eyes, clearly devastating. Extreme weight loss, persistent cough, high fever, night sweats, and a pallor that came from the body being slowly deprived of healthy red blood cells. But the Victorian eye did don't see devastation, or rather, it saw devastation and decided that certain parts of it were beautiful. The fever produced flushed cheeks and bright, glittering eyes. The wasting produced a fragile, willow-thin silhouette. And the pallor, that near luminous, blue-white translucency of skin in the late stages of the disease, became one of the defining aesthetic ideals of the era. Charlotte Brontë, who watched her sisters die of tuberculosis and whose own health was devastated by it, once described it as a flattering malady, because even as consumption killed, it did so while making certain people appear ethereal, otherworldly, almost like living portraits. This was not a fringe opinion. This was the mainstream Victorian aesthetic, and it shaped everything that followed. If the beauty ideal is the pallor of a dying woman, and you do not happen to have tuberculosis, what do? You find something that produces the same effect, and Victorian women found quite a few things. Lead-based white face paint had been used in Europe for centuries. Queen Elizabeth I had famously coated her face in a preparation called Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, to cover the smallpox scars that her own illness had left behind. By the Victorian era, this practice had evolved and expanded, but the fundamental chemistry was the same. Women applied lead-based creams, powders, and enamels to their faces, necks, and arms to achieve the pale, smooth, almost porcelain finish that the era admired. The irony was absolute, and it was slow. Lead applied to the skin repeatedly over time corrodes it. The skin becomes damaged, discolored, rough. And so a woman would apply more lead paint to cover the damage that the previous lead paint had caused. The more you wore, the more you needed to wear next time. It was a cycle with one direction and no exit. And nobody with the power to stop it was particularly motivated to do so. The women selling these products made money. The physicians endorsing them made money. And the women using them were told repeatedly and in print that any health complaints they experienced were the result of other factors entirely. The beauty columnist Mrs. S.D. Powers, who wrote an enormously popular series of advice pieces for Harper's Bazaar in the 1870s later, collected into a book titled The Ugly Girl Papers Offered Her, readers' guidance on dozens of cosmetic preparations. And while she occasionally cautioned against the most obviously dangerous substances, her column also recommended coating the face with opium paste overnight as a treatment for rough skin, washing with ammonia in the morning to freshen the complexion, applying mercury preparations as an eye treatment to encourage lash growth, opium on the face, ammonia as a morning wash, mercury near the eyes. Each of these things was presented in the measured, authoritative tone of a wise friend offering helpful advice, which is precisely why so many women followed the guidance. Because who questions a wise friend? Then there were the wafers. If lead paint occupied one end of the Victorian beauty poison spectrum, the applied end, the external end, the wafers occupied the other end entirely, because the wafers were something you ate. By the 1890s, a product called Dr. James Campbell's Safe Arsenic Complexion wafers was being sold throughout the United States and Britain. They were small, white, chalk-like tablets designed for what the advertisements described as delicate nibbling. They promised to clear freckles, remove blemishes, eliminate the muddy or yellow skin tones that the era found unacceptable, and produce a deliciously clear, translucent complexion. The Sears, Roebuck catalogue essentially, the Amazon of the 1890s, reaching households across the entire country, listed them for sale alongside garden tools and household goods. The 1898 catalogue's advertisement for similar products described them as possessing what it called the wizard's touch in producing, preserving, and enhancing beauty of form. They were advertised as perfectly harmless. They contained arsenic. Arsenic, which the Victorians were well aware, was a poison. It was used as a murder weapon often enough that Victorian newspapers covered arsenic poisoning cases with grim regularity. Women who poisoned inconvenient husbands did so with arsenic. Everyone knew this, but arsenic at low doses for a time produced something genuinely notable, a smoother, clearer complexion. This was not imaginary. The mechanism was real, if brutal. Arsenic interfered with the production of melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color. A woman who nibbled these wafers consistently would indeed notice over several weeks a paling and clearing of her skin. What she would not notice. At first was everything else that was happening. Because arsenic accumulates in the body over time. It attacks the kidneys. It damages the nervous system. It causes a condition called arsenical keratosis, in which the skin develops hard, wart-like growths, particularly on the hands and feet. It disrupts the production of red blood cells in ways that eventually become serious. And it causes, as a long-term effect, a distinctly greenish cast to the complexion exactly the opposite of what the wafers promised to achieve. A physician in San Francisco raised the alarm during this period, writing in a medical publication that he worried arsenic poisoning was being chronically misdiagnosed in women of the city because women routinely neglected to tell their doctors they were taking cosmetic products that contained it. They were embarrassed, or they did not think it relevant, or they did not connect the symptoms they were experiencing with the little white wafers they had been nibbling with their morning tea. I want you to think about something for a moment. We look at this history, and it seems, from here, almost incomprehensible. How did women not know? How did they continue? How could the physicians and beauty writers and catalog companies be so casual about products that were visibly causing harm? But I want to gently push back on that incomprehension, because the same forces at work in Victorian beauty culture the authority of experts, the pressure of beauty standards, the profitability of products that promise transformation, and the very human tendency to trust what we are told by people and institutions we've been taught to respect. These forces have not gone anywhere. What has changed is the specific substances. What has not changed is the structure of the situation. And if that observation makes you want to go check the ingredients list on something in your bathroom cabinet, then I think you are exactly the kind of thoughtful person this story was made for. But poison was not only what Victorian women applied. It was, in one genuinely strange chapter of this history, something they pursued in their environment as well. A beauty writer named Lola Montezan, actress, performer, and author of a volume called The Arts of Beauty, published in 1858, documented something she had heard about during her travels in Syria, which is now part of Austria. Women there, S. He wrote, regularly bathed in springs that contain naturally occurring arsenic. They believed and reportedly achieved an effect of brilliant, even skin through this practice. Montez described seeing women there who had developed what she called a transparent whiteness of complexion through years of this habit. She also noted the less appealing detail that once a woman began this practice, she could not stop. The body had acclimatized to the arsenic. To cease suddenly would, she was told, cause a rapid physical collapse. They were, in the most literal possible sense, addicted to their beauty regimen. And then there was Belladonna. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade as it is more bluntly known in English, was used as an eye treatment. A few drops placed directly into the eyes dilated the pupils dramatically, producing the wide, dark, luminous gaze that the era associated with femininity and sensitivity. The watery, glittering eyes of the consumptive recalled in cosmetic form. It worked. The effect was real and immediately visible. Women who used it were told it was fashionable, that it enhanced their appearance, that men found such eyes irresistible. What they were not always told with, as that belladonna in the eyes also causes blurred vision, difficulty focusing, sensitivity to light so severe that ordinary daylight becomes painful. And with repeated use, it causes progressive damage to the eyes that, in a number of documented cases, resulted in permanent impairment of sight. Women were going blind for beautiful eyes. I do not say this to be sensational. I say it because the matter-of-fact reality of it tells us something profound about the relationship between Victorian women and their own bodies. They had been taught, very effectively, and from very young ages, that their physical appearance was their primary currency. Their value in the marriage market, their social standing, their moral character, all of it was read on their faces. Of course, they would pay extraordinary prices to maintain that face. Of course, they would follow whatever advice was given by those who presented themselves as authorities. The tragedy is not that Victorian women were vain. The tragedy is that they were given so very little else to be valued for. There is a painting that sits in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and if you have never sought it out, I would gently encourage you to do so. It is called Madame X, painted in 1884 by the American artist John Singer Sargent, and it depicts a young socialite named Virginie Gautreau. The painting is severe and extraordinary. Gautreau stands in a black evening gown, her body turned slightly, her profile sharp against a dark background. Her skin is the color of marble, not healthy pale, not fashionably pale, but the specific cool, almost bluish white of something that has been drained. She achieved this effect deliberately. Gautreau was known throughout Parisian society for her extreme beauty routines. She powdered her face with lavender powder to add a ghostly blue tint. She painted fine blue lines on her skin with indigo to simulate the veins beneath. She coated herself in a heavy enamel, the lead and arsenic paste that beauty advisors called enameling, and then stood perfectly still in social situations, because any significant movement risked cracking the surface. She was wearing her face the way you wear a mask. She stood statue still at dinner parties to protect the illusion. The painting caused a scandal when it was exhibited at the Paris Salon that year, not because of the cosmetics, but because of the shoulder strap of her dress. A single strap had fallen off the shoulder, suggesting something too intimate for polite society. Sargent, devastated by the response, eventually repainted it to right the strap on her shoulder. The painting was derided, and he left Paris. What no one at that salon seemed particularly concerned about was the fact that the celebrated beauty they were both admiring and criticizing was painting blue veins onto her skin and coating her face in lead. That, apparently, was just Tuesday. We have spent this part of our evening in a rather dark cabinet, and I think it is worth stepping out of it for a moment before we move on, just to breathe. Because here is what I keep coming back to every time I read about Victorian cosmetics. Every time I encounter another product, another ingredient, another casual recommendation in another beauty column. The women who used these things were not passive. They were not simply doing what they were told without thought. Many of them knew, or suspected, that what they were doing carried risks. Lola Montez herself warned quite clearly about the dangers of arsenic and lead in the same breath she was describing them. The contrad. Actions were visible even then, but they made calculations, the same calculations that people have made throughout history and continue to make today. That some things are worth a risk if the alternative is being considered insufficient by the world around you. What I wish, deeply and genuinely, is that the world around them had offered them a broader range of things to be sufficient at. But we're not done yet. Not even close. Because the external pressures of the Victorian beauty cabinet, as damaging as they were, existed alongside something even more physically demanding. Something that began at the waist and worked its way, quite literally, into the body's interior. The corset was not just a garment. It was, for many women, a structural intervention in the architecture of the human body itself, and what it did to the women who wore it daily from childhood into old age was a story that Victorian physicians documented in increasingly alarming detail. Stay with me. That is exactly where we are headed. Every now and then in history, an object comes along that tells you everything you need to know about the society that produced it. Not a weapon, not a law, not a piece of architecture. Just an ordinary object. Something made by hand, worn by millions, purchased in shops and advertised in magazines. something so embedded in daily life that the people who used it stopped noticing it was there. The Victorian corset was that object. And what it tells you, once you really look at it, is a story that manages to be simultaneously mundane and extraordinary, about the relationship between beauty and pain, about what happens when a society decides that the natural human body is something to be corrected rather than inhabited, about the distance that can grow over generations between what we tell ourselves is normal and what the body quietly knows. Before we go any further, I want to clear something up, because the corset has accumulated, over the century since it fell out of fashion, a considerable mythology. Some of it accurate, much of it embellished, and a few specific claims that are simply not true. Nobody had ribs surgically removed to fit into a corset. Historians and medical researchers have found no evidence this ever happened. The fainting couch, that romantic piece of Victorian furniture we've all seen in films, supposedly installed in every parlour so that women could collapse into it, mid-conversation, was not actually called a fainting couch by anyone in the Victorian era. They called it a daybed. The name fainting couch was invented much later by people looking backward at history with a certain cinematic flair. I mention this not to dampen the drama, but because the real story is actually more interesting than the myths and more sobering. Here is how it worked. By the 1830s, a technical innovation had transformed corset construction. The introduction of metal eyelets, first developed in France in 1828, allowed the backlacing to be drawn significantly tighter than before without the fabric giving way. Steel bony. NG gradually replaced whalebone over the following decades, and the combination metal eyelets, steel boning, and adjustable backlacing made it possible to reduce the circumference of the waist to a degree that had previously been structurally impossible. The fashionable target for a Victorian wasp waist was somewhere between 17 and 20 inches. To put that in perspective, the smallest available modern women's clothing size in the United States typically starts at around 23 to 24 inches at the waist. That gap, 3 to 6 inches, is not trivial. That is the gap that required a significant intervention in how the body was being held together. For most women, the corset was simply part of getting dressed. It provided genuine support for the bust and spine in an era before bras existed and before women's clothing was constructed to stand without it. Worn at a moderate tightness, it was not dramatically different from wearing a firm, well-fitted undergarment. Many women found it genuinely comfortable, or at minimum unremarkable, in the same way that you might wear shoes without thinking about them. But for a significant portion of Victorian women, primarily os of the middle and upper classes, for whom appearance was a professional and social obligation, moderate was not enough. And for their daughters who began wearing modified corsets almost from infancy, the consequences were something else entirely. A young girl in a prosperous Victorian household would typically begin wearing some form of boned or stiffened undergarment in early childhood. By the time she was approaching adolescence, this had evolved into something closer to an adult corset. By her teenage years, she was wearing the full garment, and by the time she reached adulthood, her body had grown quite literally around it. The effect of wearing a corset through the years of physical development was that the muscles of the back and abdomen, the muscles responsible for supporting the spine and ever, developed their full natural strength. They did not need to. The corset was doing that work for them, and muscles that are not called upon do not build themselves. The medical literature of the 1880s is full of descriptions of this process. One journal article from that decade described women of middle age losing height not by stooping, as men might, but by a process it called actual collapse, sinking down, and attributed this directly to the perishing of the muscles that had never been properly used, because the corset had done their job for them from girlhood onward. And here is the particular cruelty of it. A woman who had grown up in a corset and then attempted to go without one, perhaps following medical advice, perhaps during pregnancy, perhaps simply for comfort in the heat of summer, would frequently find that she could not manage it. After an hour or two of attempting to hold herself upright, without the external support she had worn every waking day of her life, her back would begin to ache, then genuinely hurt. Some women reported that they simply could not sustain it, that the pain became severe enough to be incapacitating. They were dependent on the garment, not by choice or vanity, but because their bodies had adapted to it as a structural necessity. The corset had become, in the most literal medical sense, a replacement for the muscles that had never been allowed to develop. And some women, documented in medical reports of the period, went to sleep at night, still laced into their corsets, because the act of removing the corset caused such a rapid change in blood pressure and thoracic pressure that it produced faintness or genuine illness. They could not take off their underwear without risking unconsciousness. That is not a myth. That is what the historical record describes. There was a woman named Emma Thursby, a celebrated American concert soprano who performed throughout Europe and America in the last decades of the 19th century. She was enormously popular, known for a voice of unusual purity and range, admired in concert halls from New York to London to St. Petersburg. And she left behind, among her personal papers, a letter written in the summer of 1900. The letter is addressed to a friend, and in it Thursby describes something she is clearly not particularly amused about. She writes quite plainly that she had ordered a doctor's corset, meaning a corset marketed as medically designed for health benefits from a shop in Paris. She wore it for 2 days. She then reports that it upset all my internal arrangements and made her sick at her stomach, and that her personal physician, Dr. Fisher, told her she should never wear that particular design again. She ends the relevant passage with a note about the price of the replacement corset she then had to source elsewhere, 80 francs. 80 francs was not a trivial sum in 1900. But the thing that strikes me most about that letter is not the expense. It is the phrase, upset all my internal arrangements, because that is exactly what an ill-fitting or too tight corset did. The organs of the abdomen, the stomach, the liver, the intestines occupied a specific and ordered arrangement in the body. Consistent pressure from an external garment shifted that arrangement, sometimes temporarily and sometimes in ways that persisted long after the corset was removed. The medical establishment, to its credit, was not entirely silent on this subject. Although it was slow, inconsistent, and hampered by the same social assumptions that pervaded the rest of Victorian culture, it did speak. The Lancet, Britain's most prestigious and widely read medical journal, published what the records describe as more than one article per year on the dangers of tight lacing between the late 1860s and the early 1890s. In June of 1890, it ran a piece titled, "Death from Tight Lacing, Not Metaphorical Death, Actual Documented Death," one case described in the medical literature of T. The period noted that the patient's heart had been found so impeded in its action as to render life impracticable. The heart was physically prevented from beating properly by a piece of clothing. A German physician named Samuel Thomas von Sermering had first raised the alarm as early as 1793, publishing a treatise specifically on the health dangers of corsets. By 1832, a British publication titled On Voluntary Distortions of the Human Figure by Artificial Compression had added more documentation. By 1896, Dress and Health, an appeal to antiquity and common sense, was making the same arguments again to a public that was still debating whether any of it was true. A century of medical warnings. More than 100 years of increasingly urgent documentation of organ displacement, rib deformation, back muscle atrophy, respiratory restriction, and circulatory consequences. And yet the corset remained, because the physicians warning against it were competing with something more powerful than medical evidence. The social reality that a woman without the right silhouette was not a respectable woman, that her worth was, in part, visually legible. and that the waist was the most legible part of all. I want to be fair here, because it matters to the story. Not every Victorian corset caused damage. Not every woman who wore one suffered. Historians who have studied surviving garments, including the fashion historian Valerie Steele, whose work on the subject is exhaustive, point out that most Victorian women were probably not lacing themselves to the extremes that the most dramatic medical reports described. The average Victorian waist, measured from actual surviving dresses of the period, was significantly larger than the 18-inch horror stories that circulated in the press. Many women simply wore a moderately supportive garment and got on with their lives. But the women who were lacing tightly, and they existed in sufficient numbers to fill multiple volumes of medical literature, were doing genuine harm to themselves. And more importantly, every girl who wore even a moderate corset through her developmental years was affected in ways that she might not have been aware of until decades later, when her back gave way early or her internal organs began causing problems with no obvious explanation. There is also the question of the children. A letter published in a Victorian magazine in a discussion of corsets reproduces, without irony or apparent alarm, the account of a young girl who writes that her relative has insisted she reduce her waist to 17 inches, because the relative's words, "No man will marry a girl unless she looks smart." The girl asks for advice on whether she should wear a leather belt beneath the corset, or sleep in it overnight, and tighten it gradually, day by day. She is a child asking how to endure pain, because she has been told that her marriageability depends on the circumference of her waist. I do not have a clean, analytical response to that. I just have a pause and a feeling that I think most of us share. What brought the corset down eventually was not medicine. The medical argument had been running for over a century and had not been sufficient. What brought it down slowly, and then quite rapidly in the years following the First World War, was a change in what women were being asked to do with their bodies. When women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war years, working in factories, in offices, in roles that required physical movement and sustained physical effort, the corset's incompatibility with functional activity became simply impossible to ignore. A body that could not breathe deeply could not do the work. A woman who needed to be careful about how she moved could not operate heavy equipment. The garment retreated not because society suddenly decided to be kind about it, but because the demand for women's labor temporarily outweighed the demand for women's silhouette. That is a depressing fact about how change sometimes happens, but it is an honest one. There is something I think about sitting with this history. The Hunterian Museum in London, part of the Royal College of Surgeons, has in its collection something that most visitors probably pass without much notice. It is the thorax, the rib, kage, of an elderly woman who lived and died in the late 19th century. The bones are visibly, permanently deformed, not broken, not diseased, reshaped, pushed inward and compressed in a pattern that is unmistakably the result of decades of tight external pressure. She wore her corset every day of her adult life, as she had been taught. She never chose differently, because choosing differently was not really an available option for her. And when she died, the evidence of that daily compliance was written into the very structure of her skeleton. History has a way of making visible the things that daily life keeps hidden. That skeleton is Victorian women's hygiene in its most unadorned and literal form. We've been moving through the external life of Victorian women, what they put on their bodies, how they managed their hair, their skin, the physical structure of their silhouette. But there is an interior dimension to this story that we have not yet touched, a part of women's lives that was, by the standards of the era, so private and so surrounded by silence that many Victorian women faced it entirely alone, without anyone ever having explained it to them. The monthly experience that half the human population has always shared, and that Victorian medicine, that same profession writing papers in the Lancet and dispensing advice on corsets regarded with a mixture of confusion, condescension, and extraordinarily confident wrongness. That is where the story goes next. Silence is its own kind of record. When historians go looking for evidence of how Victorian women experienced menstruation, the first thing they encounter is not documents or diaries, medical records. It is an absence, a gap in the archive, a subject so systematically avoided in published writing, in personal correspondence, in household manuals, in the popular press, that its very invisibility tells you everything about the culture that produced it. Victorian women menstruated, of course they did, and yet, for most of the 19th century, this factor biological reality shared by roughly half the population, recurring every month for several decades of a woman's life, was treated in public life as though it simply did not exist. No word for it in polite conversation. No products for it in most shops. No explanation given to girls approaching puberty. No honest medical discussion accessible to the women who experienced it. Just a set of whispered euphemisms passed from woman to woman in low voices when no men were near. The curse, the monthly sickness, the terms, being unwell. And beneath that silence, a reality that was, when you look at it clearly, one of the most physically and emotionally demanding aspects of Victorian women's lives. Let me tell you about something that is documented in first-person accounts that have survived from this period. An that I find almost impossible to read without feeling a deep, specific kind of sadness. A woman who was born in 1882, which puts her squarely in the late Victorian corner. World described later in her life the experience of getting her first period at around age 16. She had not been told anything, not by her mother, not by her mother, not by any female relative, not by anyone. The subject had simply not been introduced. And when it happened, when she woke up one morning to find blood and had no framework whatsoever to understand what was occurring, she became, in her own words, hysterical. She believed she was dying. She ran to her older sister, who told her what was happening. That is how she found out. At 16, from a sister who herself had probably found out the same way, from another sister, or a neighbor, or a whispered conversation that constituted the entire educational provision available to women on this subject. 16 years old, believing she was dying because no adult in her life had judged this information important enough to share in advance. I do not know what to call that exactly. Negligence feels too clinical. Cruelty feels too intentional. It was, I think, the natural consequence of a culture that had decided the subject was so shameful, so private, so thoroughly improper to discuss that even the most basic functional information could not be passed along in any systematic way. The medical establishment, when it chose to speak about menstruation at all, did not make things better. In 1869, a doctor named James MacGregor Allen addressed the Anthropological Society of London. He informed his audience a room full of educated men that women during menstruation were, in his precise words, invalids, unfit for any great mental or physical labor. This was not a private opinion muttered at the back of a lecture hall. This was a formal, scientific address, delivered with the full weight of professional authority to one of the most prominent intellectual societies in Britain. 22 years later, in 1891, the health reformer John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the same person whose name appears on your breakfast cereal, though perhaps this particular context will make that brand association feel somewhat different, published his Lady's Guide in Health and Disease. In it, he wrote that a teenage girl experiencing her period should be relieved of taxing duties of every description and should be allowed to yield herself to the feeling of malaise which usually comes over her at this period, lounging on the sofa or using her time as she pleases, lounging on the sofa, as though menstruation were a leisure activity, as though the appropriate response to a biological process was to remove women from participation in ordinary life for several days every month, and as though the women who were doing exactly this, working in factories, managing households, raising children, doing the physical labor that kept the Victorian world running, were somehow constitutionally failing by not lounging on sofas when they were supposed to. Most Victorian women did not have sofas to lounge on. Most Victorian women got up and continued their lives regardless, because the alternative was to lose wages, lose their positions, or simply leave the work undone. The medical literature suggesting bed rest and retreat was addressed to women of leisure. Everyone else improvised.
And what did that improvisation look like?
The most common approach throughout the Victorian era was the cloth rag, flannel or cotton fabric cut or torn into strips, folded to create some degree of absorbency, and positioned inside the clothing as best the woman could manage. The challenge of securing these cloths in place was substantial because the Victorian undergarment situation was, to put it diplomatically, not designed with this function in mind. The open-seated drawers worn by many Victorian women, which we discussed, in the context of the corset for their practical bathroom utility, were, in the context of menstruation, the opposite of helpful. There was nothing to anchor a cloth pad against. Women devised their own solutions. Pins, ties made from additional strips of fabric, close-fitting petticoats that could hold things approximately in place. The cloths, once used, had to be washed discreetly. This was its own particular ordeal. In households where laundry was done communally, or by servants, the challenge of washing menstrual cloths without them being seen or remarked upon by anyone required a level of logistical ingenuity that would have been comical if the stakes were not so real. Women dried them in private, often in their bedrooms or in out-of-the-way corners where they would not be encountered. A woman writing about her grandmother's experience from this era describes the sisters of the household going to extraordinary lengths to hide the drying cloths from the men in the family. Not because the men would have been actively unkind about it, necessarily, but because exposure to male awareness of the subject was itself a source of shame. The shame was not earned, but it had been constructed systematically and effectively over generations until it felt as natural as gravity. For women in workhouses, those grim Victorian institutions, where the desperately poor were housed and put to work in exchange for food and minimal shelter, the situation was considerably worse. Historical records indicate that women in workhouses largely managed without any dedicated means of absorption at all. The floors of some manufacturing facilities, particularly textile mills, were lined with straw or sawdust during certain periods. This accommodation was not discussed openly. It was simply arranged, a quiet, architectural acknowledgement of something that was simultaneously universal and unspeakable. By the end of the Victorian era, the first tentative commercial products had begun to appear. In 1896, Johnson & Johnson released what they called Lister's towels, named in honour of the British surgeon Joseph Lister, who pioneered antiseptic surgery. They were pads made of cotton and gauze, designed to be held in place by an elastic belt. They were sold in stores in the United States, and they failed almost immediately. Not because they did not work. They were a genuine improvement on cloth rags in terms of convenience. They failed because the social stigma around menstruation was so thoroughly entrenched that women were embarrassed to be seen purchasing them in shops. The product required a public transaction. The public transaction required acknowledging, in the presence of a shop assistant, that you menstruated, and for enough Victorian women, that acknowledgement was simply impossible to make. The product sat on shelves. The manufacturer stopped advertising it, because advertising it meant putting the word sanitary in a public context, which was itself considered improper. The first disposable menstrual product in American commercial history failed because the culture surrounding menstruation made it unsellable. There is something philosophically interesting here, if you will stay with me for a moment. Victorian medicine was, in many ways, extraordinaire, wryly interventionist about women's bodies. As we've already seen, corsets recommended from infancy, cosmetic preparations endorsed by physicians, beauty regimens with medical authority behind them. The Victorian doctor had quite a lot to say about what women put on their bodies and how their bodies should look from the outside. But when it came to the interior experience of those same bodies, to pain, to discomfort, to the monthly reality of menstruation, the medical establishment had almost nothing useful to offer. What it had instead was theory. In 1848, a doctor named Althaus wrote that hysteria was caused by sudden suppression of the menstrual flow. The treatment he suggested included cold water applications, limited food intake, a horizontal posture, liberal doses of opium, and, if those proved insufficient, the application of sulfuric acid as an astringent. Sulfuric acid as a treatment for menstrual difficulties. I will pause on that for a moment. In 1868, additional extreme treatments were being proposed in published medical literature. In 1894, an article in the Cincinnati Lancet and Clinic argued that the connection between a woman's menstrual cycle and her criminal history was so significant that any offense committed during a menstrual period should be considered the product of emotional impulse rather than rational agency, and should render the woman legally irresponsible for her actions. Women were not only physically unfit during menstruation, in the Victorian medical view, they were potentially criminally irresponsible. Their judgment was suspended by their biology, and the medical profession was the appropriate authority to explain this to the courts. I want to be precise about what this meant in practice. It meant that a woman's monthly biological experience was being used simultaneously to exclude her from intellectual and professional life on the grounds that she was too fragile, to participate and to exclude her from legal agency on the grounds that she was too irrational to be held responsible. She was both too delicate to work and too volatile to be trusted, too weak and too dangerous. The logic was not internally consistent. It did not need to be. It served its purpose regardless. Can I ask you something? Do you know what the word hysteria means etymologically? The root of it. It comes from the Greek word for uterus, the womb. Hysteria, as a medical concept, was from its very foundations a condition located not in the brain or the nervous system or any particular organ with documented pathology, but in the female reproductive anatomy itself. If you had a uterus, you were constitutionally susceptible to hysteria. Your very biology made you a potential medical case. This was not the fringe position of a few eccentric practitioners. This was the medical mainstream. It shaped how doctors spoke to women, how they dismissed women's pain, how they explained women's behavior to courts and to husbands and to the women themselves. It was the intellectual scaffolding on which Victorian medicine's relationship with the female body was built, and it shaped, in very direct ways, how Victorian women understood and experienced their own menstrual lives. If the medical experts told you that your monthly cycle made you irrational, weak, prone to madness, unfit for work, and potentially dangerous, how were you supposed to relate to that experience? How were you supposed to develop any relationship with your own body that was not fundamentally colored by shame? The answer in the historical record is that most women developed a pragma, tick compartmentalization that I find quietly remarkable. They did not have the luxury of the medical debate. They had work to do. Diaries from the period, those that touch on the subject at all, show women noting their cycles in terms of inconvenience and practicality rather than illness. The cloth, rags to be managed. The timing relative to social engagements. The particular discomfort of a heavy day at work while managing all of the above. They recorded it as part of life. Because it was part of life. Because they had no other framework to put it in, and because the framework being offered by the medical establishment was not one they could use. I think that pragmatism, that quiet getting on with it in the face of conditions that were uncomfortable, underprepared for, and systematically under-addressedis, one of the defining characteristics of Victorian women's experience that the portraits and the parlor paintings have never quite captured. The silver frames and the silk gowns, the composed expressions, the world arranged just so, and underneath all of it, women managing their lives with the tools available to them, in silence, with extraordinary competence. Now, the silence around. During menstruation was, as we have established, nearly total. But there was one form of women's physical experience that Victorian medicine chose to discuss at enormous and enthusiastic length, one condition that attracted not discretion and avoidance, but extensive publications, confident diagnosis, and a range of treatments that moved, depending on your social class and your physician's particular approach, from the mildly eccentric to the genuinely bewildering. That condition was hysteria, which we have now defined, and the treatments for it were, in certain documented cases, stranger than most things we've encountered in this story so far. That is where we're going next. I am going to be gentle about how I describe it, but I'm not going to leave it out, because it is part of the story, and it belongs here. The word hysteria has a long history. It shows up in ancient Greek texts, in medieval medical manuscripts, in Renaissance treatises. It travels across centuries, shifting its meaning slightly as it goes, picking up new interpretations and new treatments, shedding old ones. By the time it arrives in the Victorian era, it has accumulated so much cultural weight that it functions less as a medical diagnosis and more as a categoria container, something you put women into when you could not explain what was happening to them, or when what was happening to them was inconvenient to acknowledge. And, in the Victorian era, a great many things about women were inconvenient to acknowledge. I want to start with the ancient Greeks, just briefly, because the origin of this story is so absurd that it sets the tone for everything that follows. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates believed that hysteria was caused by the uterus literally moving around inside the body. In his model, the womb could detach from its moorings and travel upward through the torso, pressing against organs as it went, causing whatever symptoms happened to result. If it pressed against the lungs, difficulty breathing. If it pressed against the heart, palpitations. If it reached the throat,
a sensation of choking. The treatments he suggested were designed to lure the wandering uterus back to its proper place. Pleasant smells applied near the lower body to attract it downward. Unpleasant smells near the nose to repel it upward. That is the foundational theory. A womb that travels treated with that. See aromatherapy.
This theory was taken seriously for roughly 2,000 years. And while the Victorian era added considerably more scientific language and considerably more equipment to the discussion, the core assumption that women's bodies were fundamentally unstable in a way that men's bodies were not, and that this instability explained a wide range of behaviors and complaints, persisted from Hippocrates all the way to the 1890s. In the Victorian era, hysteria had expanded its diagnostic reach to a degree that would be almost comic if the consequences were not so serious. The symptoms qualifying a woman for a hysteria diagnosis, as listed in Victorian medical literature, included faintness, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, heaviness in the abdomen, muscle spasms, shortness of breath, irritability, loss of appetite. And this is the one I find most revealing. What the medical literature called a tendency to cause trouble. A tendency to cause trouble. Think about what that actually means as a symptom. Not a physical sensation, not a measurable biological marker. The behavior of being difficult, of not complying, of causing, from the physician's perspective, inconvenience. According to one estimate circulating in Victorian medical circles, approximately a quarter of all women in Britain and America suffered from hysteria. A quarter. If you accept the symptoms as listed, it becomes immediately clear why. The symptoms described are, in large part, simply the experience of being a woman under considerable social pressure in the 19th century, filtered through a medical framework that interpreted all of it as pathology. The treatments, when we get to them, require me to keep my word from the previous section. I will be gentle about how I describe them, but I will not be evasive, because evasion would do this history a disservice. The first and most standard recommendation for married women diagnosed with hysteria was Victorian physicians documented quite openly in the medical literature of the period, more frequent intercourse within their marriages. This was considered a primary and physiological treatment. The uterus in the Victorian theoretical framework was a system that needed to be, as the physicians put it, properly occupied. The marital bed was the first prescription for unmarried women, nuns, widows, and women for whom the first prescription was inapplicable. A different approach was available. It was called pelvic massage. It was performed in the physician's office. The goal, as the medical literature recorded in rather clinical language, was to bring the patient to what Victorian doctors called hysterical paroxysm. Modern medicine would call it something considerably more straightforward. The physician Rachel Maines, who researched this history in considerable depth, observed something particularly striking about how this practice was documented in Victorian medical texts. The physicians described it entirely without erotic connotation. It was recorded as a mechanical procedure, a medical intervention, a technology of relief applied to a malfunctioning biological system. The fact that what was being produced was a female orgasm was, in the Victorian medical mind, apparently not the relevant framing. It was simply the expected result of a standard treatment. Whether the women receiving it understood it the same way is a question the historical record does not fully answer. What the record does document is that physicians found the procedure extraordinarily time-consuming. It could take an hour or more, and that this was considered its primary practical problem. Not any ethical complication, not any question about consent or framing or the nature of the treatment. The problem was that it took too long and tired out the doctor's hands. The solution, which emerged over several decades of the Victorian period, was mechanical assistance. By 1870, a clockwork-driven device was available for physicians' offices. By 1873, the first electromechanical device of this type was in use at an asylum in France. By the end of the century, such devices were listed in medical reference books, including the 1899 edition of the Merck Manual, as standard equipment for the treatment of hysteria. They were presented in medical catalogues alongside stethoscopes and surgical instruments, ordinary medical technology. But the pelvic massage treatment, strange as it was in some ways the more benign end of the Victorian hysteria spectrum. In Paris, at the Salpêtrière Hospital, originally a gunpowder factory converted in the 17th century into an institution for poor and mentally ill women, and by the Victorian era presided over by the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, something considerably more theatrical was happening. Charcot was, by any measure, a brilliant physician. His work on multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and various neurological conditions was genuinely groundbreaking. Sigmund Freud studied under him, as did others who went on to found significant branches of modern medicine. But Charcot was also captivated by hysteria, and his approach to it transformed the condition into something that sat uncomfortably and revealingly at the intersection of medicine and spectacle. On Tuesday evenings at the Salpêtrière, Charcot held public lectures. He would bring in female patients. Some of them had been institutionalized there for years, having arrived with conditions ranging from depression to epilepsy to grief, and some simply because their husbands or families had brought them and left them at the gates. And he would demonstrate their hysteria for audiences. He would induce what he called hysterical fits using hypnosis. The women would faint, contort, weep, arch backward. Charcot would narrate the proceedings as scientific demonstration. These performances attracted large audiences. Medical students certainly, but also artists, writers, members of Parisian society who aim as one might come to an unusual theatrical event. The women being demonstrated were, in a phrase used by one contemporary scholar, not so much cured as displayed. The irony that these hysterical women who were supposedly too irrational and unstable to be trusted with their own lives, were being asked to perform on command for audiences of strangers, and that their ability to do so on schedule somehow did not prompt questions about the diagnosis does not appear to have troubled the physicians involved. Meanwhile, in America, a neurologist named Silas Weir Mitchell had developed what he called the rest cure, and it was, in a different way, equally troubling. Mitchell's rest cure began in the early 1870s and spread rapidly through the medical establishment on both sides of the Atlantic. By the 1880s, it was one of the most widely prescribed treatments for women diagnosed with nervous disorders, hysteria, and what the era called neurasthenia, kind of generalized exhaustion of the nervous system that physicians believed was caused by the excessive demands of modern life. The rest cure was precisely what it sounds like. Complete bed rest, 6 to 8 weeks. The patient was confined to bed, forbidden from reading, from writing, from any intellectual activity whatsoever. She was fed on a high-fat diet to build up physical strength. She was massaged and given mild electrical stimulation to prevent muscle atrophy from the enforced immobility. And she was, critically, isolated from her family and her social world. Any correspondence was limited or monitored. Mitchell believed that the primary cause of nervous exhaustion in women was too much mental and creative activity that educated, ambitious, intellectually engaged women were, in effect, using their brains in ways that their constitutions could not sustain. The rest cure was designed to switch all of that off, to return the patient to a state of physical plenty and mental blankness, from which it was hoped she would emerge restored. There is a woman whose name you may know, though perhaps not primarily from this context. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was an American writer and social theorist, later well known as a journalist and critic. In 1886, after the birth of her daughter, she experienced what we would now recognize, without any difficulty, as severe postpartum depression. In her own words, she suffered from a severe and continuous nervous breakdown tending to melancholia and beyond. She sought help from Silas Weir Mitchell, then considered the foremost nerve specialist in the country. Mitchell diagnosed her with hysteria. He prescribed the rest cure, and here is what he told her when he sent her home. After the initial treatment, this is documented in her own autobiography, his instructions. Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you all the time. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. To a writer, as a cure. Gilman followed his instructions for 3 months. In her own account, she came during those months so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see it clearly from where I stood. She eventually rejected the treatment, picked up her pen again, and began to write. A few years later, in 1892, she published a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper. It is the story of a woman confined to a room by her physician husband, forbidden to write, slowly losing her mind within the walls of what was supposed to be a rest cure. It is one of the most devastating pieces of writing to come out of the Victorian era. And Gilman said, quite plainly, later in her life, that she wrote it specifically to address Dr. Mitchell, to put on paper what his treatment had done to her and to women like her, to make the damage visible. She sent a copy to Mitchell. He never responded, but the story circulated. It was read, it endured, and it eventually helped shift the medical conversation about women's mental health in ways that the rest cure itself never managed. I want to say something here that I think matters. Silas Weir Mitchell was not a monster. Jean-Martin Charcot was not simply a villain. They were physicians of their era, operating within the frameworks available to them, believing, and this is important, that they were genuinely helping the women under their care. The rest cure was prescribed with sincere therapeutic intent. The Salpêtrière demonstrations were understood as science, not cruelty. What makes this history difficult, and why I think it deserves to be told, alongside the hair powder and the arsenic wafers, and the corsets, is precisely that sincerity. The damage done to Victorian W. omened by the hysteria framework was not primarily the work of malicious actors. It was the work of a cultural assumption so deeply embedded that the most intelligent and well-intentioned men of the era could not see outside it. The assumption was simply this: that the female body was a problem, that women's emotions, women's discomfort, women's resistance, Women's ambition, all of it was evidence of a system in need of correction, and that the correction belonged properly to medicine. That assumption is what made it possible to prescribe bed rest to a writer and call it healing, to demonstrate women's suffering for Tuesday evening audiences and call it science, to record the pelvic massage in the medical literature without any apparent awareness of what was actually being recorded. History is full of moments that look different depending on where you stand. This is one where I find it difficult to find the other angle. One of the women who spent years at the Salpêtrière was a patient who became known in the medical photography of the institution as its most famous subject. She was called Blanche, and she was sometimes referred to as the Queen of Hysterics, a title that says something. Eyeing rather damning about how her situation was framed, Blanche eventually left the institution. She became in later life an employee there, working in the photography laboratory and eventually in radiology. She refused in her later years to discuss her time as a patient. What she had experienced and how she had experienced it, she kept private until her death. She developed radiation-related illness in her final years and died in considerable pain. She is remembered, when she is remembered at all, primarily as a figure in Charcot's photographs, as someone who was demonstrated, not as a person with her own continuous interior life that extended beyond the hospital walls. That gap between what a woman was reduced to and what she actually was is, I think, the thread that runs through this entire story we are telling tonight. Victorian medicine's understanding of women was, in most respects, wrong.
Not slightly off, not in need of adjustment.
Fundamentally, structurally, consequentially wrong. And yet it held authority. It shaped policy. It shaped law. It shaped how women understood themselves. What eventually changed it was not a single discovery or a single moment of enlightenment. It was the accumulation of women speaking. In stories like Gilman's, in the suffragette movement's insistence on political personhood, in the slow, difficult work of women entering medicine and science and the professions and bringing different observations to the same evidence. Change in this register is always slow, and it is never quite complete. We've been moving through the medical and the physical and the institutional dimensions of Victorian women's lives. But there is one aspect we've not yet explored, and it connects everything that comes before it in a way I find particularly revealing. It is the question of what Victorian women actually wore beneath all those layers. And I do not mean the corset, which we have already covered. I mean something smaller, something that sounds almost absurdly modern when you first encounter it, and then reveals itself to be one of the more practical innovations of the entire era. The crotchless undergarment, and why it existed, will tell you something both funny and profound about the architecture of Victorian daily life. That is coming up right now, all right. After that particular chapter of Victorian medical history, I think we have earned something a little lighter. Not entirely light, but lighter. So, let us talk about underwear. Specifically, let us talk about the fact that Victorian women, those paragons of propriety, those women who covered their piano legs with fabric because the exposed wood of furniture was considered slightly too suggestive, routinely wore undergarments with no crotch seam, open all the way through by design. Sanctioned by their physicians, described without embarrassment in the sewing manuals of the era, and, in at least one documented case, part of Queen Victoria's personal wardrobe. A pair of her open-seat knickers went to auction in recent years and sold for a rather considerable sum, which I think tells you everything about how much human beings love a surprising footnote. This was called, in polite Victorian terminology, split drawers or open drawers, and the reason they existed was so blindingly practical that once you understand it, you will never again look at elaborate Victorian fashion with quite the same bewildered respect. Here is the problem that split drawers solved. A Victorian woman of the middle class, getting fully dressed in the morning, was putting on approximately 6 to 8 separate garments before she even touched her outer dress. The chemise first. A long linen undergarment, that went to the knee and protected the skin from everything worn on top. Then stockings secured with garters. The corset next already a project in itself, as we've established. Then the crinoline or cage structure, if the fashion required it, or the bustle frame at the back, if it was the later decades. Then petticoat, sometimes one, sometimes several. Then a corset cover. Then the skirt, and possibly a separate bodice. By the time a Victorian woman was fully dressed, she was encased in somewhere between 15 and 30 pounds of fabric, boning, and structural undergarment. It is not a metaphor to say that she was wearing architecture. She genuinely was. Now, in the middle of the day at a dinner party, or a shopping expedition, or a church service, or any of the dozens of social engagements that filled the Victorian calendar, this woman needs to use the toilet. How? This is a question that has genuinely baffled people who encounter Victorian fashion for the first time, and the answer is both simple and a little magnificent in its practicality. You lift the skirts. Them, gathered up at the back with both hands, which required considerable coordination and developed into something of a skill. The crinoline, being a lightweight cage construction rather than the enormous solid bell it appears in paintings, was malleable enough to be gathered. The skirts would press up flat against the back. And then, because the split drawers had no fabric in the center, you could simply sit or squat over a chamber pot, and nothing in the entire arrangement needed to be removed or undone at all. The split in the drawers was the engineering solution to a problem created by everything else. I find this genuinely delightful, honestly. Not because it is silly, it is not. It is efficient, but because it is such a perfect example of the Victorian approach to everything we've been discussing in this story. The construction of an enormously complex external system, requiring equally complex internal adaptation to navigate. The elaborate clothing created a problem. The split drawers solved it. No one talked about the split drawers in polite company. The problem was managed in silence, with pragmatism, and the elaborate clothing continued to be admired, as though the manager, immense beneath it, did not exist. This is Victorian women's daily life in miniature. The toilet situation itself, separate from the underwear question, was another chapter in the long saga of Victorian women managing their bodies within a system that had not been designed with their comfort or convenience in mind. For most of the Victorian era, for most households, the toilet was not inside the house. It was outside. The privy sat at the back of the property, sometimes quite far from the house itself, and it was used in all weathers, in all seasons, often in the dark. In urban areas, particularly in the tightly packed working-class neighbourhoods of London, Manchester, and Birmingham, the situation was often considerably worse. Historical records describe scenarios where 100 houses, an entire block of densely packed city dwellings, shared a single privy. These pits were periodically dug out and emptied, a job performed by workers called night soil men, who came in the hours before dawn. The waste would then be carted through the streets and, in many cases, deposited into the nearest waterway, which was, in some parts of the city, also the source of drinking water. For women specifically, Etially, there was an additional layer of difficulty. The outdoor privy was a communal space. It offered no real privacy. And for a Victorian woman whose entire social existence was built around the maintenance of modesty and the management of bodily discretion, the prospect of being seen entering a privy and, by implication, being known to perform whatever it was one performed, there was a matter of genuine social anxiety. The chamber pot, kept under the bed or in a commode in the bedroom, was the more private alternative. It required carrying and emptying, generally by servants in households that had them, and personally in households that did not. The commode was the more refined version, a piece of furniture that concealed the chamber pot within a cabinet, allowing the function to be performed in the bedroom without visual acknowledgement of what the cabinet contained. Here is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely surprising, even now. In 1851, London hosted the Great Exhibition. It was held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, an enormous glass structure of dazzling ambition, and it attracted visitors from across Britain and from countries all over the world. Ions of people attended over the 5 months it was open. And at this exhibition, a sanitary engineer from Brighton named George Jennings debuted something that would change the world: the first indoor, flushing public toilet. This was not a philosophical novelty. It was a practical revelation. Visitors could pay 1 penny, and there is your etymology, by the way, for the phrase, to spend a penny, which generations of British English speakers have used ever since as a delicate circumlocution for going to the toilet and use these clean, tiled, extraordinary facilities. 827,000 men bought tickets to use them during the 5 months of the exhibition. 28 women did. 28. The facilities built for the Great Exhibition included separate provisions for both sexes. The physical opportunity existed, but the social reality was this. For a Victorian woman to be seen entering a public toilet was to publicly acknowledge that she had a body that required such things. And that acknowledgement, in 1851, in polite society, was considered deeply improper. The disparity between those two numbers, 827,000 men and 28 womenes, one of the most quietly devastating statistics I have encountered in all of Victorian history. Not because of what it says about toilets, but because of what it says about what Victorian women were expected to be. They were expected to be, in George Bernard Shaw's later phrase, angelic. And angels, the reasoning went, did not have bodies that made demands. This situation, the near-total absence of public toilet facilities for women, had consequences that extended far beyond personal discomfort. In the mid-19th century, as cities grew and more women began working in shops, in offices, in factories, the question of where they were supposed to go became impossible to ignore. Women who worked in shops might go an entire working day without any access to toilet facilities. Women who worked in factories were in an even more difficult position.
Hygiene.
The split drawers, in this context, served an additional function for working women on factory floors. A quiet, private, efficient way of managing physical needs during a working day that offered no formal provision for them. The phrase that historians have applied to this situation is the urinary leash, the idea that, without access to toilets in public spaces, women could not travel far from home, could not spend extended time in the city, could not participate freely in public life. Their geography was bounded by their bladder capacity. And because the Victorian ideal held that women belonged in the domestic sphere, in the home, this constraint was, from the perspective of those who held power, a feature rather than a problem. The first women's public convenience that might be called purpose-built in London did not appear until the late 1880s, near Piccadilly Circus. Installed partly because the fashionable department stores of the area had realized that female shoppers would spend more money if they could spend more time in the city. Commerce, as it turns out, was a more effective advocate for women's bladders than idealism had been. In 1899, the Bankill Ladies' Public C. Convenience opened in Berwick-upon-Tweed. The attendant, a woman named Mrs. Jameson, recorded that, on its opening day, 62 women came through the door. The charge was 1 penny. She collected 5 shillings and 2 pence. I find something quietly moving in that number. 62 women on the first day. Women who had been in that town until that day, managing without. When Selfridges opened its Oxford Street store in London in 1909, it included from the very beginning toilet facilities for women. It is sometimes noted that suffragette campaigners used those facilities as a base during their campaigns in the area, because they were one of the few reliable places in central London where they could go. The fight for women's toilets and the fight for women's votes, it turns out, were not entirely separate movements. Both were, in the end, arguments about whether women had a right to exist in public life on the same terms as men. Let me step back for a moment and look at this pattern, because it is, I think, one of the most consistent threads running through everything we have covered. The bodily reality of Victorian women was systematically and repeatedly treated as a problem to be managed, hidden, or denied. Menstruation was unspeakable. The need to use the toilet was, for most of the century, officially ignored in the public sphere. The physical effects of corsets were visible in X-rays and in the deformed ribs of museum specimens, and yet were argued against in the letters columns of magazines by women who insisted their small waists were natural gifts. Hysteria was diagnosed and treated on the assumption that women's bodies were inherently problematic, simultaneously too fragile and too dangerous. And through all of it, women found ways, split drawers for practical navigation of the elaborate clothing system, dry powders and brushes for hair that was washed monthly at most, cloth rags managed with pins and ingenuity, sponge baths, creative arrangements of petticoats and chamber pots, a constant, quiet, largely undocumented labor of management that made the visible surface of Victorian femininity possible. The gap between what Victorian women were supposed to be and what they actually were is the gap this whole story lives in. You might be wondering at this point in the evening whether any Victorian women pushed back. The answer is yes, loudly in some case. With great intelligence and increasing organizational sophistication. The dress reform movement, the women's suffrage movement, the fight for women's public toilet provision, the gradually expanding access to female physicians. These were not passive developments. They were argued for, campaigned for, written about, and in many cases personally sacrificed for by women who understood exactly what the constraints of their physical lives were costing them. But we are going to get to that story in its proper place. First, there is one more chapter of the interior life of Victorian women that we have not yet properly explored, and it concerns, of all things, their teeth. Because while everything we have discussed so far relates to hygiene in the most intimate sense, the story of Victorian dental health takes what I would describe as a genuinely dramatic turn. It involves dentists extracting teeth as wedding gifts. It involves teeth sourced from battlefields. It involves a beauty culture that destroyed the very things it was supposed to enhance. And it involves a custom that is, once you hear it, almost impossible to believe was ever considered kind. That is where we're going next. And DI would suggest keeping your jaw firmly in place, because this story has a tendency to drop it. Teeth. Let us talk about Victorian teeth, specifically about why, in painting after painting of Victorian women, you almost never see a smile that shows them. It is not because Victorian women were shy. It is not because smiling was considered vulgar, though there were certainly social rules about the degree of smile appropriate for a formal portrait. The more honest reason is simpler and considerably more uncomfortable. For a significant portion of the Victorian era, showing your teeth was revealing something you very much preferred to keep hidden. The state of dental health in 19th century Britain and America was, in a word, catastrophic. Not catastrophic by the standards of the 17th century, when teeth were lost routinely and replaced with nothing, and nobody particularly expected anything different. Catastrophic by any reasonable human standard, the standard that says people should be able to eat food without wincing and keep their own teeth past the age of 35 and not experience dental abscesses as a regular feature of daily life. And yet, this was exactly where, at Victorian women alongside everyone else in their era were, navigating every single day in elegant parlours and modest cottages alike behind closed lips. The roots of the problem go back several generations before Victoria's reign even began. Sugar from its early history as a luxury item available only to the very wealthy had been, by the mid-19th century, democratized. The expansion of plantation agriculture in the colonies, the industrialization of sugar processing, and the reduction in import costs had made what was once a rare delicacy into an everyday ingredient. By the 1840s and 50s, sugar was in the tea, it was in the jam, it was in the biscuits and the cakes and the puddings that defined Victorian domestic culture. Middle-class households consumed it in quantities that would have been unimaginable to their grandparents. And sugar, metabolized by the bacteria that live in the mouth, produces acids that attack tooth enamel. Victorian dentistry had not yet caught up. The toothbrush, in its modern form that is, with bristles arranged on a handle, had been invented in 1780 by a man named William Addis of Clerkenwell, who reportedly came up with the idea while he was in Arsenic and used a bone he saved from dinner, with some bristles obtained from a guard. His is a wonderful story of entrepreneurial resourcefulness. Mass production of toothbrushes began in the late 1830s. They were available. They were affordable, at least for the middle classes. But what people brushed their teeth with was, in many cases, nearly as damaging as the problem it was meant to address. Tooth powders, the Victorian equivalent of toothpaste, were made at home or purchased from chemists, and they varied enormously in their composition. The better ones combined chalk, castile soap, and aromatic oils, peppermint, cloves, orris root. These were, by most assessments, relatively harmless and occasionally genuinely effective. But the more abrasive ones contained ground brick dust, crushed eggshells, pumice, cuttlefish bone, and charcoal. Charcoal was enormously popular because it did produce a visible whitening effect in the short term. Charcoal scrubbed stains from tooth enamel with impressive efficiency. It also, over time, scraped away the enamel itself, the very protective layer that the tooth powder was supposed to help maintain. One Victorian reference book from the 1860s, Recome, ND ground charcoal for whitening, and then noted in the next sentence that abrading powders have much to answer for in hastening the day of the toothless race. In the same breath, recommend and warn. The product is good, and also here is the catastrophic long-term consequence. The most alarming whitening option, though, was not charcoal. It was sulfuric acid. Various Victorian dental advice columns mentioned diluted acid as a method for removing stubborn stains from teeth. The mechanism was real. Acid dissolved the surface discoloration. The problem was also real. Acid dissolved a certain amount of the tooth beneath the discoloration. At the same time, the treatment produced a genuinely dramatic short-term result. And then, a few days later, the teeth were noticeably worse than before, more sensitized, more vulnerable to decay, which would eventually require another round of treatment. And so the cycle continued. If any of this is beginning to sound familiar from our conversation about Victorian skin care and lead-based cosmetics, it is because the logic is exactly the same. A treatment that works visibly and immediately in the short term. That damages the thing it is treating on. Bury the long term. Administered by an era that either did not yet understand the mechanism or did not consider the long term its concern. Let me introduce you to a character I find genuinely fascinating. Not a specific woman, but a specific type of man who was a fixture of the Victorian landscape. The tooth drawer. In the early decades of the Victorian era, dedicated dentists existed, but they were largely concentrated in cities and available only to the reasonably prosperous. For everyone else, dental pain was addressed by whoever in the local community had the necessary combination of nerve and equipment. Blacksmiths sometimes pulled teeth. So did barbers, whose medical sideline included a range of minor surgical services. And then there were the traveling tooth drawers. Itinerant practitioners who moved from town to town and village to village, announcing their arrival with decorated stages hung with strings of extracted teeth, sometimes dressed in elaborate or theatrical costumes, drawing crowds in the manner of a street performer. The performance element was not entirely separable from the medical function. The tooth drawer needed to be able to work quickly, in public, with anesthetic, on a patient who was likely in considerable pain and even more considerable fear. Having an audience helped, in a strange way, because it created a kind of social theatre that the patient participated in. You submitted to the tooth drawer's pliers. The crowd watched. It was painful, but it was also a public act that you survived, and survival was itself a kind of social currency. Anesthesia for dental work did not become available until the 1840s, when ether began to be used for surgical procedures. Even after that, access was uneven, and many procedures continued to be done without it for economic and logistical reasons. Going to the dentist in the Victorian era was, for most of its duration, a deliberate decision to endure substantial pain in exchange for relief from a different pain. The calculus was real, and the threshold was high, which is why so many people did not go until they absolutely had to, which is why the teeth that remained in people's mouths were often in advanced states of decay, which is why Victorian portraiture so consistently keeps those mouths closed. And now, the detail I promised you. The one that tends to make people go very quiet when they first encounter it, the wedding gift. Here is a practice that was documented in Victorian England and Scotland, particularly in working-class and lower-middle-class communities, with enough frequency that historians have treated it as a recognizable phenomenon rather than an isolated oddity. When a woman married, her husband or sometimes her own family, as a practical act of care, would arrange for her to have all of her remaining teeth extracted and replaced with dentures. All of them. Not the decayed ones, not the ones causing immediate problems. All of them. The reasoning was economic, and in its grim way, logical. Dental work was expensive. Future dental work was unpredictable. A woman who entered marriage already furnished with a complete set of dentures would never again require a dentist. The expense was incurred once, up front, and then as far as the family's financial planning was concerned, the dental question was resolved permanently. There are documented accounts from Victorian Scotland of mothers taking their daughters not on their wedding day, necessarily, but as a rite of passage around the same tometa, have every tooth removed, as a kind of practical gift, a preparatio. N for the financial realities of adult life. One memoir describes a young woman being brought to a local butcher who strapped her to a chair and pulled all her teeth, one after another, with pliers. No anesthetic. Ceramic dentures fitted afterward. This was presented and received not as cruelty, but as provision. I want to stop and sit with that for a moment. The decision to remove a healthy young woman's teeth, all of them, preventively because future dental costs were considered an unreasonable financial burden, was framed as kindness, as practical love, as a good husband's or a good mother's provision for the future. And I think the reason it disturbs me so much is not that it was wrong. We can agree easily that it was wrong. What disturbs me is that it was wrong in exactly the same way that so many other things in Victorian women's experience were wrong. It was a decision made about a woman's body by people who controlled the economic circumstances of her life, framed as being for her benefit, with whatever discomfort or damage resulted simply accepted as the reasonable cost of practical management. The corset, the arsenic wafers, the rest cure, the teeth, all of it in its era, framed as care. Now, the dentures themselves deserve a brief word, because their sourcing was, in the earlier decades of the Victorian era, as unsettling as the practice of removing healthy teeth to provide them. Human teeth, when they could be obtained, were considered the best material for dentures, not ivory, which was available but which absorbed moisture and stained unpleasantly and smelled over time in ways that the wearer found difficult to conceal, not porcelain, which was hard and clattered when the wearer spoke or chewed. Real human teeth, set into a base of ivory or later vulcanite rubber, were the premium product. They looked right. They fit naturally against the mouth. They were the closest approximation to the original. The question of where these teeth came from was not one that polite Victorian society examined too closely. Some came from people who had sold them. The desperately poor, aware that their overall health prospects were limited, sometimes chose to sell their teeth for whatever payment a dentist or tooth dealer would offer, knowing that they likely would not outlive the usefulness of the teeth they were surrendering, knowing that the payment might feed a child or settle a debt. It was a choice made under conditions that made it barely a choice at all. Many came from battlefields. The Battle of Waterloo, fought in June of 1815, which predates the Victorian era by just over 2 decades, but supplied its dental market for many years afterward, produced approximately 43,000 casualties. Most were young men, soldiers in their teens and 20s and 30s, whose teeth were, by military standards, in reasonable condition. British soldiers, in fact, were required to have functional teeth because they needed to be able to bite open paper cartridges when loading their rifles. Dental fitness was a practical military requirement. When these men fell in battle, they were buried in mass graves, and their teeth were extracted as part of that process. Barrels of Waterloo teeth shipped out from Belgium, traveling to London and Paris, New York and beyond. They continued arriving in dental supply houses for years afterward. The phrase Waterloo teeth entered the dental lexicon and remained there for decades. The earliest reference historians have found to the specific term appears in an American dental journal from February of 1858, more than 40 years after the battle itself. The supply had been that extensive, and the demand that sustained. Does this trouble you? I find it genuinely affects me every time I read about it. Not because the dead were being disrespected in any unique Victorian way. The dead have always been put to whatever uses the living could find for them, but because the whole chain of events feels like it is explaining something about value, about whose body is considered a resource and whose is not, about the distance between the person who wore the dentures in a comfortable parlor and the person whose jaw they had once been attached to. The woman at the dinner table with her Waterloo teeth, her face arranged in the careful, close-lipped half-smile that Victorian social convention recommended, has a story beneath her appearance that the portrait will not show you. Victorian teeth, in the end, are a microcosm of the entire story we've been telling tonight. A surface maintained with great effort, a reality beneath it that was complicated, painful, economically shaped, and managed in silence. By the end of the Victorian era, dentistry had genuinely professionalized. The first dental school in London opened in 1858. Mass-produced toothpaste in collapsible tubes appeared in 1880, pioneered by an American dentist named Washington Sheffield, who had the idea after watching his son describe Parisian painters squeezing paint from tubes. Colgate followed with their own tube in 1896. The equipment was improving. The training was improving. Anesthesia was more consistently available. But the damage of several generations of sugar consumption, abrasive tooth powders, and deferred dental care was not reversible by improved toothpaste. The Victorian era ended with a population in which tooth loss was considered a normal and expected part of aging, in which dentures were common enough that they were largely unremarkable, and in which the gap between the smile Victorian portraits presented and the dental reality beneath it was one of the era's many quietly maintained illusions. Now, we have spent this entire evening moving through the private, physical, often hidden dimensions of Victorian women's lives. The hair and the bathing and the poison cosmetics and the corsets and the medical frameworks and the underwear and the teeth. But there is a version of this story that we've been circling, and I aren't to go there now, because Victorian women were not simply passive subjects of all of this. The era also produced some of the most remarkable women in the history of the English-speaking world, women who looked at the constraints we've been describing and decided, deliberately and at considerable personal cost, to push against them. The dress reform movement, the suffragettes, the women who entered medicine and law and journalism and science against enormous resistance, the ones who wrote about the rest cure from the inside and forced the conversation into public view. Their story is not separate from the hygiene story we've been telling. It grew directly out of it, and it is where we are going next. Stay with me. We are nearly at the part where this long, strange, uncomfortable history turns a corner. Of all the sensory experiences you cannot get from a museum, a textbook, or a period drama, the one I think about most is this. What did the past actually smell like? Not in the obvious way. We all know that medieval cities were odoriferous, that the Thames had its famous moment of infamy in the 1850s, that outdoor privies and coal fires and livestock in city streets created an atmosphere, ospheric reality quite different from our own. We know that in a general sense. But, I mean specifically, what did a Victorian woman's drawing room smell like on a Tuesday afternoon in September? What was the particular mixture of scents that drifted through the air when a group of well-dressed women sat together at tea, their clothing perfumed with lavender water, their hair treated with orris root powder and pomade, their skin unwashed since the previous week's bath, the coal fire burning in the hearth, the pot of tea steaming on the table? The answer, I think, would be considerably more complex than we tend to assume, not simply unpleasant. Not simply pleasant either. Something layered and specific to its era. Something that would immediately, unmistakably tell you when you were. And how Victorian women managed that olfactory reality. What they used, what they prioritized, what they ignored is one of the more revealing chapters of this story. The relationship between smell and Victorian social life was, in a word, complicated. On one hand, the Victorians were deeply, genuinely, almost philosophically attentive to the question of how things smelled. This was not merely a preference. By the mid-19th century, sanitary reformers had developed what was called the miasma theory of disease, the idea that illness spread through foul-smelling air rather than through contaminated water or direct contagion. This theory was, as we now know, incorrect. But for most of the Victorian era, before the germ theory of disease became broadly accepted in the 1870s and 80s, it was the dominant framework for understanding public health. The practical consequence was that the smell of something was considered by many educated people to be evidence of its danger. Bad smells were believed to cause disease. Good smells were believed to ward it off, or at least indicate safety. Perfume was not merely cosmetic in this framework. It was, in a very real sense, a prophylactic. And on the other hand, Victorian social code demanded that people not acknowledge anything related to the smell of the human body. Not their own, not anyone else's. To reference body odor in conversation was to commit a profound breach of etiquette. You were not supposed to notice. You were certainly not supposed to say anything. So you had a society that believed smell was literally a matter of life and death. Living alongside a social code that treated the smell of the human body as an unmentionable subject. The tension between those two positions produced some genuinely interesting behaviors. The primary tool available to Victorian women for managing their personal scent was, for most of the era, perfume, not in the concentrated, long-lasting form we associate with modern fragrance, but in a considerably more diffuse and pervasive way. Victorian perfume etiquette was subtle. The guidelines that circulated in ladies' manuals and fashion columns were almost unanimously clear. A properly scented woman should not smell of perfume in any obvious sense. The goal was not to project a specific fragrance. The goal was to not smell of anything at all meaning, not smell of the body beneath the clothing. Perfume was applied not to the skin directly, which was considered excessive and slightly vulgar, but to handkerchiefs, to gloves, to hair pomade, to the inner linings of dresses, where it would diffuse gently through movement. Lavender water was enormously popular for this purpose. It was light, clean, relatively inexpensive, and had the advantage of smelling inoffensive to virtually everyone. Queen Victoria herself was notably fond of Creed's Fleur de Bulgarie, a blend of rose, musk, bergamot, and ambergris, which is a secretion produced in the digestive system of sperm whales, and which smells, when processed, somewhat warm and earthy, and not at all like what its origins would suggest. The perfume industry of the Victorian era relied on ambergris, civet, and musk animal-derived ingredients as fixatives that made the lighter floral notes last longer on fabric and skin. The eau de cologne that dominated the early Victorian era was described by the food and social historian Ruth Goodman as a sharp, clean scent that cut through other smells. That phrase reveals a great deal. The point was not to replace the ambient olfactory reality of the Victorian environment. It was to cut through it, to establish a small personal zone of relative freshness in an environment that offered, in many locations, rather different sensory conditions. Here is a question I want to put to you. If you walked into a room and everyone present smelled more or less the same, not unpleasant, exactly, but present, human, physical, would you notice? Or would it simply be the baseline against which everything else was measured? This is actually an important question for understanding the Victorian relationship with body odor, because one of the things that researchers who have studied this history consistently note is that the concept of personal body odor as a problem to be solved is in significant part a modern invention. Not because bodies did not produce odor in previous centuries, they obviously did, but because in a world where everyone around you is operating at a similar level of hygiene, and where the ambient environment includes coal smoke and animals and open drains and the smell of cooking from open fires, the specific contribution of personal body odor becomes considerably harder to isolate as a distinct issue. You notice a smell when it deviates from your baseline. Victorian noses, calibrated to a different baseline from ours, may have perceived the personal odor landscape rather differently than we would. What changed this? And this is where the story takes a genuinely surprising turn. Was not soap. It was not improved hygiene. It was an advertising campaign. In 1888, a product called Mum was trademarked and brought to market in the United States. It was the first C commercial deodorant, a waxy cream containing zinc oxide as its active ingredient, sold in a small metal tin, applied by rubbing under the arms with the fingers. It worked in the sense that zinc oxide does inhibit the bacteria responsible for body odor. But it also felt, to most of its customers, unnecessarily intimate in its application process, left residue on clothing, and raised the immediate social question of why exactly one was using such a product. Most people who encountered it thought they were fine without it. Many considered the whole concept unnecessary, unhealthy, or both. Mum existed on pharmacy shelves for 2 decades without making a significant cultural dent. Then came Edna Murphy. Edna Murphy was a teenager in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the years around 1910. Her father was a surgeon who had developed a liquid antiperspirant, not merely a deodorant, but a product that actually stopped sweating rather than just masking odor for the practical purpose of keeping his hands dry during surgery. Edna, who had a gift for entrepreneurial thinking that would eventually reshape the entire personal hygiene industry, tried her father's formula on her own underarms, found it effect. I've named it Odorono, as in odor. Oh no! And started a company. The early years of Odorono were not encouraging. She borrowed $150 from her grandfather to rent office space, Charles. Then had to move operations to her parents' basement because her team of door-to-door saleswomen could not generate enough revenue. Pharmacists returned the product unsold. The obstacles were not primarily chemical or logistical. The obstacle was cultural. This was still very much a Victorian society, noted Julian Civilka, a historian of American advertising, describing the period around 1910. People did not discuss sweating. Women did not discuss sweating. The idea of a product specifically designed to address what your underarms did when you were warm was not merely awkward to sell. It implicitly required acknowledging that a lady's body did things that ladies did not acknowledge their bodies did. The product had another problem. Odorono contained aluminum chloride as its active ingredient, which was effective but somewhat corrosive. It irritated sensitive skin. It stained fabric, sometimes turning it red. The American Medical Association, examining it in 1913, concluded it was likely to clog pores. Murph. Wise own instructions to customers advised not shaving before application and applying the product before bed, allowing it to dry overnight before contact with clothing. A product that stings, stains your clothes, and needs to be applied the night before you want it to work is not, on the face of it, a compelling offer. And yet, in the summer of 1912, Murphy set up a booth at a trade exposition in Atlantic City. The exposition ran all summer. The summer was hot. People sweated through their clothing and became suddenly, personally, experientially aware of the problem that Odorono was designed to solve. Sales began. Murphy went home with $30,000 in receipts. But $30,000, while encouraging, was not the revolution. The revolution came from an advertising agency. By 1919, Murphy had taken out a $50,000 bank loan, scaled her operation, and hired the J. Walter Thompson advertising agency in New York to handle her marketing. A copywriter there named James Young was tasked with figuring out why Odorono was not selling better in its target market. He conducted what was essentially a survey, and what he found was straightforward. Most women did not think they had a problem with underarm odor. They were not aware of it as an issue, so he created the issue. The campaign Young developed for Odorono ran in Ladies' Home Journal in 1919. It described, in carefully calibrated language, the social consequences of what it called the most humiliating moment. A woman being rejected, overlooked, avoided, or quietly disparaged by men in her social circle, not because of anything she had done, but because of something her body was doing without her knowledge. The campaign told women, in so many words, "You may not know that you have this problem, but the men around you do, and they are not telling you." This was not a gentle pitch. It was, by the standards of its era, shockingly direct. The editors of Ladies' Home Journal received 200 complaint letters, calling the advertisement vulgar and offensive. It was the kind of response that today's advertising industry would probably call engagement. And the sales numbers told a more important story. Within 12 months, Odorono's sales had increased by 112%. The campaign had invented a new social anxiety. It had taken something that was not, for most women, a conscious concern, their underarm smell, and turned it into a source of potential humiliation. And then it had offered the solution. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to sit with, because it sits at such an uncomfortable intersection. On one hand, deodorant and antiperspirant are genuinely useful products. Their development improved daily life in real and practical ways. The increase in urban density, the growing expectation of close social proximity in offices and public transport, the change in women's clothing toward fabrics less suited to hiding perspiration, all of this created a genuine shift in the social context of personal hygiene. On the other hand, the mechanism by which these products were sold, the deliberate creation of a fear of one's own body, the suggestion that your natural functioning was a source of secret social failure that others were aware of but too polite to mention, was a machinery of shame that had particular and lasting consequences for women. Because the campaigns targeted women first. Men came later with different language. For men, body odor meant professional failure. For women, it meant romantic failure. The message was that a woman's social desirability was at risk, that the invisible why of men around her was passing quiet judgment she could not detect, and that her best protection was a product she was now being told she could not afford to be without. The Odorono campaign of 1919 was not the first time women had been sold a product on the basis of making them afraid of their own bodies. We have spent the whole of this evening with women who were sold arsenic wafers and lead paint and rest cures on precisely that basis. But the Odorono campaign was the point at which the approach became systematized, tested, measurably effective, and commercially replicable. It became the template. It proved that you could manufacture a new category of personal shame and sell the antidote in the same advertisement. That template is still in use today. In every advertisement that implies your natural human functions are a social liability. In every product that promises to make you acceptably odorless, hairless, smooth, or otherwise less visibly physical than a human being naturally is. The chain from Victorian perfume to the 1919 Odorono campaign to the bathroom cabinet most of us maintain today is not a line of pure progress. It is a line of evolving commerce, shaped by what women can be persuaded to fear about themselves. I want to be clear about something. None of this means you should throw away your deodorant. That is your decision. And, honestly, if you're planning to take public transport tomorrow morning, I would gently suggest you keep it. Pragmatism is a virtue. But I think it is worth knowing that the idea that you have a problem that requires fixing specifically, the idea that your body, left to its own devices, is a source of social embarrassment is not an ancient human truth. It is, in large part, a product of an advertising campaign that was run by a specific company. Written by a specific man in a specific year and measured in units of shame and subsequent sales. The Victorians managed their scent with lavender water applied to handkerchiefs and a shared cultural understanding that this was the best anyone could do. They were not wrong about the limitations of their situation. They were working with what they had, and most of them, by all historical accounts, regarded the whole question of personal scent as they regarded everything else in this story. A private matter managed quietly, not discussed. That silence was, as we have seen, sometimes a cage, but it was also occasionally a kind of dignity. We're nearly at the end of this story. Not quite, but nearly. There are 2 chapters left. The first is about the enormous gap in what Victorian women's hygiene experiences looked like, depending entirely on which side of the class they were born to. Because everything we have discussed so far has existed in a kind of middle ground, and the extremes of that inequality are, in their own way, as revealing as anything else we've covered. And the last chapter is the one I've been building toward all evening. The one about what we take for all of this. What the mirror of Victorian women's lives shows us if we are willing to look clearly about our own. That is where we are going. Stay with me. There is a temptation when telling a story like this one to speak about Victorian women, as though that phrase describes a single experience, a shared reality. As though the woman in the parlor and the woman in the mill were navigating the same world through the same constraints. They were not. Everything we have discussed over the course of this evening, the bathing, the hair, the cosmetics, the corsets, the dental care, the perfume, all of it existed on a sliding scale, determined almost entirely by where you happened to be born in the social order. The gap between how a gentlewoman in Kensington managed her hygiene and how a factory worker in Manchester managed hers was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of species. And to tell the story of Victorian women's hygiene without accounting for that gap is to tell only the more comfortable half of it. So let us look at the other half. In 1842, a lawyer and social reformer named Edwin Chadwick published a document that would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant public health reports in the history of the English-speaking world. Its full title was Report on the Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population of Great Britain. It was not a pleasant read. Chadwick and his team of commissioners had travelled the country for years, talking to people, examining living conditions, recording what they found. What they found in the industrial cities that had swelled beyond all capacity to manage their own populations was a sanitary situation that the wealthy districts of those same cities had almost no conception of. The report contained a specific finding that became one of the most quoted statistics of the Victorian era. In Liverpool in the 1840s, the average age at death for a labourer and his family was 15 years. 15. Not life expectancy from birth, which is pulled down by very high infant mortality rates. This was the average age at which a working-class person in Liverpool died. The same figure for a gentleman's family in the same city was 35 years. In rural areas, professional men reached an average of 52. 20 years of life. 2 decades. The gap between being born into the professional class and being born into the labouring class in Victorian Liverpool was, on average, 20 years of life expectancy. That number is not an abstraction. It is 20 years of being a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend, 20 years of watching children grow up, or not growing old enough to see it. 20 years of experience and wisdom and ordinary accumulated time. And the primary driver of that gap was not genetics or individual choices, or any other variable that could be attributed to the people themselves. It was where they lived, what water they drank, what air they breathed, and what physical conditions they existed in every day. The women on the wrong side of that gap were not failing to be clean because they did not care. They were failing to be clean because the infrastructure of cleanliness, the clean water, the drainage systems, the indoor plumbing, the heated bathing facilities, did not exist where they lived, and they did not have the economic resources to acquire any substitute. Consider Manchester in the 1840s. Friedrich Engels spent 2 years there, in the early part of that decade, observing and documenting what he saw. His account, published in 1845, describes neighborhoods in scent. Manchester, where entire streets were built without drainage, where waste from households collected in the street and washed, when it rained, into the river that the same households sometimes used for washing, where cellars flooded regularly with a mixture of surface water and sewage, where families of 6, 8, or 10 people lived in a single room. In conditions like these, the daily hygiene rituals we have been discussing all evening simply collapse. Not because the women living in them did not want cleanliness, but because cleanliness as a physical practice requires, at minimum, access to clean water. And clean water in these neighborhoods was not reliably available. Women in these conditions washed themselves and their families in whatever water they could obtain, and heat over a fire in a single room, dwelling with coal that cost money they did not always have, carrying everything by hand up the stairs of a building that was never designed for the number of people living in it. They managed as best they could. That management was, under those circumstances, extraordinary. Here is something that I do not think gets said often enough about Victorian working-class women. While the women of the middle and upper classes were reading ladies' manuals about the correct application of lavender water and the appropriate frequency of hair washing, the women of the working class were inventing solutions constantly, practically without manuals. The wash day was a weekly event in working-class households, taking the whole of Monday for most families. Everything that could be washed was washed on Monday. Clothing, bed linen, whatever could be managed. The process involved boiling large quantities of water in a copper built-in or portable vessel, specifically for laundry and scrubbing garments, on a washboard, with harsh soap and considerable physical effort. A working-class woman's Monday was not a light day. It was manual labor by any reasonable definition. And yet, the wash day was also a community event. Women on the same street or in the same building would often coordinate their wash day, use shared facilities or help one another with the heavy work, or trade knowledge about which soap combinations worked best for which kinds of stains. The social dimension of Victorian working-class domestic life was, in this way, one of the things that made it survivable. The irony is that the lavender water and the Pear's soap advertisements were aimed at the women who needed them least. Women who had servants and running water and dedicated dressing rooms. The women who were doing the hardest physical labor around cleanliness were not the audience of the beauty culture we've been discussing. They were quite often the servants who made that beauty culture possible for someone else. In the workhouse, the situation was different again, and in some ways even more extreme. The Victorian workhouse was established in earnest following the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. It was designed quite deliberately to be unpleasant. The architects of the system believed that if the workhouse was too comfortable, the poor would prefer it to seeking work. So conditions were made harsh enough to deter all but those who were truly desperate. For women, entry to the workhouse meant immediate and complete loss of control over their own hygiene and their own bodies. clothing was confiscated upon entry and replaced with a uniform, a practical arrangement that simultaneously removed all personal identity and, in theory, provided some baseline of cleanliness. Hair, depending on the institution and the period, was sometimes cut or cropped upon admission. This was officially described as a hygiene measure. In practice, it was also one of the most visible and humiliating forms of control available to the workhouse system, because hair, as we have discussed at considerable length this evening, was for Victorian women an intimately personal possession. Facilities for bathing in workhouses varied enormously. Some institutions had communal bathing facilities that were used on a scheduled basis, sometimes weekly, sometimes less frequently. Some had almost nothing. The accounts of women who passed through the workhouse system in the second half of the 19th century, and there were many because the economic disruptions of the era pushed large numbers of women into institutional dependency, describe conditions of considerable deprivation, both physical and psychological. What the workhouse could not strip away was the social solidarity that seems consistently to emerge in conditions of shared deprivation. Women in workhouses, like women on the wash day on a shared street, helped one another, shared knowledge, shared the small resources they had, managed together. What could not be managed alone. Meanwhile, in a different part of the same city, in a townhouse with a dedicated bathing room and a copper tub supplied with hot water by a servant whose working day it partly comprised, a woman of the professional class was going through her own morning ritual. The gap between those two mornings is not merely the gap between having and not having. It is the gap between two entirely different experiences of what it meant to be a woman in the same era, living under the same queen, subject to the same social codes about modesty and decorum and the paramount importance of cleanliness as a moral virtue. One woman was being told she should be clean. She was being sold products to help her be clean. Her magazines contained advice columns about the correct way to be clean. Her moral worth was, in the dominant cultural framework, partly measurable by how clean she appeared. The other woman was being told by the same cultural framework that her class demonstrated her failure to be adequately clean, as though the sewage running through her street was evidence of a personal moral shortcoming rather than a failure of the infrastructure that the people who are. Those cultural frameworks had the power to build and chose. For decades, not to. Edwin Chadwick's report tried to point this out in the careful language of government inquiry. He argued that if you wanted working people to be clean, you needed to give them access to clean water, that the connection between poor sanitation and disease was not a character failure of the poor, but an engineering failure of the city. He was right. He was also arguing against the prevailing instinct of an era that found it considerably more convenient to view poverty as a moral condition than as a structural one. The Public Health Act of 1848, passed partly in response to another cholera outbreak, established the legal framework for government responsibility for sanitation. It was a beginning. The journey from that beginning to something approaching functional urban hygiene infrastructure took decades more and was uneven and incomplete throughout the Victorian era. Do you know what changed the sanitary situation for working-class women more than any moral argument, any government report, or any advertising campaign? The gradual introduction of water mains and sewage systems into working-class neighborhoods. Boorhoods. Not a cultural shift, not an improvement in personal virtue. Pipes. Iron pipes under the streets, carrying clean water in and waste away. The difference between the health outcomes of streets that had them and streets that did not was immediate, measurable, and dramatic. Infant mortality fell. Cholera outbreaks became less frequent and less lethal. Life expectancy began slowly to rise. Kitty Wilkinson in Liverpool, whom we mentioned earlier in this story, understood this instinctively in the 1830s, decades before the infrastructure arrived. Her boiler, open to her neighbors during the cholera epidemic, was not solving a cultural problem. It was solving an engineering one, at the level of a single woman with a single piece of equipment and a neighborhood's worth of need. The lesson was not learned quickly, but it was learned. And the learned lesson that hygiene is a matter of infrastructure and access, not of character and willpower, is one of the most important things the Victorian era contributed to public health, even if it took most of the century to accept it. I've been sitting with something through this entire part of our evening, and I want to say it plainly. The West, omen of Victorian Britain and America, who are most visible to us, now the ones in the portraits, the ones whose letters and diaries survive, the ones whose beauty rituals and social customs filled the pages of the magazines and manuals, are the women of the comfortable classes. The women who had the time to write things down, and the education and the expectation that their inner lives were worth recording. The women of the working class and the workhouse and the factory floor are almost darkly absent from the documents we tend to consult when we reconstruct the past. Their lives were not written down by them, because the conditions of those lives did not permit it. What we know of them comes from investigators like Chadwick and Engels, from parliamentary reports, from the records of charities and institutions from the outside in, rather than the inside out. That asymmetry of the archive is its own kind of violence, not dramatic violence, quiet violence, the violence of erasure by omission. When we talk about the hygiene of Victorian women, we are talking, unless we are very deliberately inclusive, mostly about the hygiene of Victorian women who left records. And that means we're talking mostly about the better off half. The women who were boiling their neighbors' contaminated laundry during a cholera epidemic, walking to a shared courtyard pump in the dark for water that may or may not be safe, managing their monthly cycle with whatever fabric was available, washing everything they owned on Monday in a copper, while also cooking and minding children. Those women are at least as much the story of Victorian hygiene as the women with the Creed perfume and the copper bathtub. Perhaps more so, because they were doing all of the same things with none of the same resources. There is one chapter left, and it is perhaps the one that matters most, because we have spent this entire evening in the past, looking backward, examining what was and what was managed and what was hidden and what was suffered. And now I want to turn, in these final minutes, and look in the other direction, at what this mirror shows us about now. At what? Looking back at us from inside all of this Victorian history, we might find uncomfortable about our own reflection. That is where we're going, and it will not take long, but I think it might stay with you. We've arrived, finally, at the part of this story that I have been quietly building toward all evening. And I want to begin it with a question, not a rhetorical one, a genuine one, the kind I actually want you to hold in your mind for a moment before we go any further. What do you consider normal? Not what you prefer, not what you find beautiful or desirable or aesthetically pleasing. I mean, what hygiene practices do you engage in that feel so fundamental, so obviously correct, so much a part of the baseline of being a decent and civilized person, that you have never stopped to ask who decided they were necessary? Because here is what this evening has been showing us, from different angles and through different chapters, the whole time. Almost nothing about modern hygiene is as ancient or as universal or as simply biological as we tend to assume. Almost all of it was decided in the past 150 years by a combination of genuine scientific discovery, commercial interest, and advertising. And the proportion of each of those three ingredients varies enormously depending on which practice you're looking at. Let me be specific about the timeline, because the specifics matter here. The Victorian era ended officially in 1901, when Queen Victoria died. By that point, germ theory had replaced miasma theory as the dominant framework for understanding disease. The first commercial deodorant, Mum, had been trademarked in 1888. The first collapsible tube of commercial toothpaste had arrived in 1880. The bathroom as a dedicated room in a home was becoming standard in middle-class houses in Britain and America. But most of what we now consider the baseline of personal hygiene, daily showering, washing your hair frequently, removing body hair, applying deodorant and antiperspirant, the specific products and frequencies and rituals that make up what we collectively call being clean, most of that was not Victorian. It was the 20th century, and much of it was manufactured. Take the idea of washing your hair regularly, not once a month, as Victorian women did, not once a week, which became fashionable in the early 20th century, daily or every other day, the frequency we now treat as more or less standard. This was not a discovery. It was a marketing decision. In the 1920s and 30s, shampoo manufacturers were selling a product that most people believed they did not particularly need. Hair was shed infrequently because hair had, for centuries, been washed infrequently and managed perfectly well with other methods. So the shampoo industry did what the Odorono campaign had done. It created a problem. Advertising campaigns began appearing that described the horror of dirty hair in language calibrated to produce anxiety. Etiquette columns, sometimes sponsored by manufacturers, began suggesting that weekly hair washing was the minimum acceptable standard, then bi-weekly. The frequency crept upward through the mid-20th century, driven not by dermatology but by commerce. Today, many dermatologists recommend washing hair every 2 to 3 days as the actual optimum for scalp health. Every day, for many hair types, strips necessary oils and causes the scalp to overproduce sebum in compensation. The Victorian approach of infrequent washing with daily brushing was not, as it turns out, as unreasonable as it sounds. Then there is women's body hair. Before 1915, no mainstream standard existed in Britain or America that said women should shave their underarms. Victorian women, with their long sleeves and their elaborate layered clothing, had no particular cultural expectation. Remove the natural hair that grew there. It was not discussed. It was not considered. It was simply present, as it had been in every era of human history before. In 1915, Gillette introduced the Milady Décolleté, the first razor explicitly marketed to women. The timing was deliberate. Women's fashion was shifting. Sleeveless dresses were becoming more visible. And Gillette, which had built its empire selling razors to men, recognized that the other half of the population was an untapped market. What followed was one of the most successful demand creation campaigns in the history of personal care. Advertisements began appearing in Harper's Bazaar and Ladies' Home Journal, describing underarm hair as an embarrassing personal problem. Gillette's own campaign materials described it as the first great anti-hair movement. The language was clinical, and the framing was social. Not that underarm hair was unpleasant in an aesthetic sense, but that it was a marker of a woman who was not modern, not hygienic, not adequately put together, just as Odorono had done with body odor 4 years earlier. The campaign was a success. By the 1920s, the norm had shifted. By the 1930s, leg hair was being added to the target. By the 1950s, leg shaving was nearly universal among American women, though the timing there was also accelerated by wartime hosiery shortages, which left women's legs more visible and therefore more subject to the standards that advertising had already set. The global women's razor market today is worth nearly $4 billion. It is expected to reach more than $5 billion before the end of this decade. All of that from a market that did not exist before 1915, from a norm that was invented by a razor company in a magazine advertisement to solve a problem that no one had previously recognized as a problem. I want to be careful here, because I am not making an argument. Or rather, I am not making the argument you might expect. I'm not saying don't shave. I am not saying stop using deodorant. Stop washing your hair. Abandon all hygiene products and return to the Victorian approach. The Victorian approach, as we've spent this entire evening establishing, had very significant problems. What I am saying is something smaller and perhaps more interesting than a practical recommendation. I am saying that the distance between I do this because it is natural unnecessary. I do this because someone decided in a specific decade for specific commercial reasons that I should feel inadequate without it, that distance is worth knowing exists. Because once you know that distance, you get to decide where you stand in it, not unconsciously, not by default, not because a campaign from 1919 told a generation of women that their bodies were socially unacceptable without a product, and the anxiety passed down through the decades like an inheritance, but consciously, with your own eyes open. The Victorians did not have that option. The women who nibbled arsenic wafers because they were told by authorities they had been taught to trust that the wafers were perfectly safe, they did not have access to the information that would have changed their choice. The women who were prescribed the rest cure and told to put down their pens did not have the power to simply walk away from the diagnosis. We do. More of us, more of the time, than ever before in history. That is not nothing. There is a thread that runs through everything we have followed tonight, from the bathwater shared by an entire Victorian family to the bone-deformed ribcage in the Who, Tasmanian Museum to the Edna Murphy advertisement in Ladies' Home Journal. And the thread is this. Every generation inherits a set of assumptions about what bodies should look like and how they should be managed. Those assumptions are presented as natural, as necessary, as obvious. They are enforced by social pressure, by commerce, by the opinions of authorities who have their own interests. And within those assumptions, people, mostly women, in the story we have been telling, do what they can with what they have, under conditions they did not choose. What changes between eras is not the fundamental human situation. What changes is the specific assumptions, the specific products, the specific authorities. The Victorian woman standing at her dressing room mirror in the early morning, working through her hair with dry powder and a long brush, was doing exactly what we do now, trying to meet the standards of her time with the tools available to her. The standard was different. The tools were different. The underlying situation woman, mirror, set of expectations she did not design is the same. If I could go back and stand in that Victorian dressing room for a moment, the one I described to. Oh, you! At the very beginning of this evening I think the thing that would strike me most is not the powders or the brushes or the elaborate architecture of the updo. It would be the effort, the quiet, daily, unacknowledged, constant effort of managing a body in a world that had strong opinions about bodies and very limited provision for managing them. The ingenuity of it. The resourcefulness, the way that ordinary women, across every class and in every corner of the Victorian world, figured out how to navigate constraints that were not their fault and demands that were not entirely reasonable and kept going. That effort was never counted as labor. It never appeared in any economic ledger. It was invisible because it was expected, because it was the baseline, because it was the baseline, because it was simply what being a woman required. And that, of all the things we have discussed tonight, is perhaps the thing that has changed the least. The portraits are beautiful. I want to say that clearly before we finish. There is real beauty in the Victorian image, in the elaborate hairstyles and the silk gowns and the composed expressions and the whole carefully constructed aesthetic of the era, and the women who are I. And those portraits were real people, living real and complicated lives, doing their best in conditions that were, as we have now established in considerable detail, considerably more demanding than the portraits suggest. They deserved better medical care. They deserved access to clean water and functional toilets and hygiene products that were not slowly poisoning them. They deserved to have their discomfort and their physical experiences taken seriously by the medical establishment. They deserved to grow up knowing what was going to happen to their bodies, without being expected to figure it out alone at 16. Most of them did not get those things, and most of them managed anyway, with extraordinary quiet competence. That is the story I wanted to tell tonight. We've been here together for a long time, through the bathwater and the arsenic wafers and the corset and the rest cure and the rest cure and the Waterloo teeth and the great exhibition and the silence around the things that mattered most. Through the class divide and the wash day and the women who opened their homes during cholera outbreaks, and the ones who had themselves demonstrated in lecture halls, and the ones who wrote their stories own afterward and sent them to the doctors who had never replied. I hope that when you look at a Victorian portrait now, you see something you did not see before. Not the silk, not the composed expression. Something behind all of that.
Something that knows more than it is showing. Something that has been working very hard for a very long time. Quietly, without acknowledgement, with more dignity than the circumstances technically required. That is where our story ends tonight. But I want you to know something before you close your eyes. Of all the things I've read and thought about and turned over in the course of putting this together, the thing I keep coming back to is this. The women in this story were not examples of what happens when things go wrong. They were examples of what people are capable of when the situation demands it. Remarkable things, as it turns out. Ordinary, everyday, quietly, remarkable things. Thank you for being here tonight. Genuinely, honestly, thank you. Spending several hours with a stranger's voice in the dark, following a long and winding story to its end, is an act of trust that I do not take lightly. I am glad you stayed. If this story found you at an eye.
Interesting angle. If it gave you something to think about or something to feel, then it has done what I hoped it would. And if you want to leave a comment telling me which part stayed with you the longest, or which chapter surprised you most, I would love to know. These things matter to me, more than you might think. Take care of yourselves tonight. Drink some water. Appreciate your shower. Maybe think about whose idea it was that the shower needed to happen every day. And in a little while, not too far away, there is another story waiting. Another corner of history that looks familiar from a distance and reveals itself, up close, to be something considerably stranger and more human than the picture suggested. I will see you there. Sleep well.